dragged me for this, huh? Okay. You think you just fell out of a coconut tree? You exist in the context of all in which you live and what came before you. Love good news. Love good news. I just love good news. I love Venn diagrams. I really do. I love Venn diagrams. It's just something about those three circles and the analysis about where there's the intersection, right? Yeah, I see people, you agree with me, right? So, okay, so I asked my team, I brought prize. Oh, round and round. To lead and
plastic straws are a big thing right now.
Yeah.
Do you ban plastic straws?
I think we should. Yes. I mean, look, I'm going to be honest. It's really difficult to drink out of a paper straw when you had, if you're just, like, if you don't gulp it down immediately, it starts to bend. Yes. And then, you know, the little thing catches it and then, you know, so we got to kind of perfect that one a little bit more.
So you'd ban it, but rely on innovation.
I mean,
you know what? This is now officially a K-Hive podcast. I love that woman.
Yeah, I mean, I used to be kind of concerned by her behavior, but it's gotten a little more charming in comparison. She has a legitimately infectious laugh. And for the record, I got this from a TikToker, this supercut, who I think put the like at the end, like the HUH. Like, what the fuck is she talking about? I get what she's talking about. It's hard with the paper straw, especially if you kind of gum on it, like I do. You know, like a lot of saliva gets on the straw, and it before you know it, it's very difficult to drink out of. So
I have said for years that nothing brings out my inner Republican like paper straws. Like, I hate those things so much.
I just sip. I'm a sipper.
Oh no. Okay. Yeah. See, Jake had to outman me. It's like, what? Use a straw?
Exactly. What show is this again?
Well, this is Give Them an Argument. I'm Ben Burgis. We are going to be joined in a few minutes by our good friend Matt McManus. We're going to be talking about G.A. Cohen's book, Karl Marx's Theory of History, in which Cohen argues that you didn't just fall out of a coconut tree. You exist in the context of everything that has come before you. And
what about being unburdened by what has been?
No, see, that's yeah, see, there are two within every one of us. There are two Kamalas, right? There's the you didn't fall out of the coconut tree, and there's the what could be unburdened by what it's been.
Is that dialectical or is that revisionist? I think that's what we need to figure out by the end of the show.
It's the main thing we're going to try to figure out in this episode.
Yeah.
But look, if you like figuring out how you didn't just fall out of a coconut tree and you exist in the context of all that's come before you, but you're also the kind of person who really likes Venn diagrams, G.A. Cohen, that's the book for you. Like lots of graphics and illustrations and trying to very precisely map out the relationships between concepts. So lots of good stuff coming up there. But we do have a few things that we want to get to first, and we'll probably bring in Matt for some of these. But maybe before that, I do want to just do a little follow up to the episode that we did last week. So last week we were covering the debate that I did about Palestine with internet person Steven Bonnell, better known as Destiny. That's the appropriate reaction to mentioning his name. And somebody, again, actually also a TikToker, I'm not totally sure who runs this account, but I think the actual name of the account is Destiny versus Destiny, put together a little montage of clips from my debate with him, and there's a little bit in the middle of his debate with Nathan Robinson. But at the beginning and the end, it's my debate with Destiny juxtaposed against remarkably similar things, thoughts that people used to throw at him in debates that Destiny used to do with far-right people, and some of his responses to those. So it makes for a pretty interesting combination. Let's give that a watch.
Why is Israel so protective of the ethnic character of the country? Why do you think that is?
What is it that's so offensive about white people saying they would like to preserve their demographic majority?
We're not the same as blacks. We're not the same as Mexicans. And there's no reason why we can't have a majority here and we can't work to preserve and defend that majority and expand it.
Well, is it not convincing to you that there's not a single country in the world with an African majority that is even close to the standards of any Western or Asian country?
Give me one Muslim or Arab majority country where Jews live happily as a minority, or you need to tell me all the reasons why it doesn't work in every single one of those particular countries. Go for it.
It is acceptable for the United States to support a country that has displaced millions of people in the last 9 months.
I think there are a host of good reasons. I think that Israel is a good trading partner for the United States. Israel is, for all of its faults, of which, there are a number to point out, Israel is a beacon of democracy in the Middle East compared to every single surrounding country. And Israel's adherence to things like rule of law make it a special country in the Middle East. And these are ideas and things that are worth championing for the United States.
I don't know if there's anything wrong with, expulsion or ethnic cleansing. It seems to me to logically follow that if a country invades or takes over part of another country, that it might expel those people or that those people might leave.
Your analysis of the failures is entirely one-sided. The Palestinians walked away. The Palestinians turned to violence. All they do is fight, 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 fight. This is a one-sided narrative.
It's true. The inception of the Palestinian movement has been one of violence.
Both parties here are violent parties.
Yes, but only one has been forced to contend with political realities on the ground, and that's Israel. That's why Israel, you can say they're violent, but they formed peace with partners that they thought they never would form peace with.
Zionism is ultimately a movement based on conquest and dispossession.
And Islam isn't? What's a caliphate? What was the Ottoman Empire?
I'm not denying the violence of the Ottoman Empire. Why would I? Why would
we talk about the intrinsic territorial conquest nature of Zionism when Zionists, Israel, have given back land and territory to other countries?
Because it's the conflict that we're talking about.
Yeah, but it doesn't make sense to say that...
You're describing one side as using violence to achieve its goals.
Yes.
Right? But
correct.
You are ignoring all of the violence on the other side.
Because I think that the Israeli side...
That's precisely what happens in the Israeli narrative.
Because what's happening is the two siding you're doing right now.
Then there's a backlash, and then you say, and they only look at the backlash.
In 1936, did Israel accept the Peel Commission, that partition was necessary and the land would need to be split?
Yeah, with, by the way, a provision to kick a bunch of the Arabs out of the proposed partition.
Because the Brits had said that it seemed like it was an unworkable thing, right?
Well, there you go, right? It would have involved violence.
It would have involved transfer of people off of property, not necessarily violence. Forcibly removing these people from their homes and shipping them off to other countries, which is one of the most aggressive acts the state could ever perform. You could argue maybe even more aggressive than execution, definitely more aggressive than imprisonment. This is already the worst treatment that you could offer somebody. So you don't tell people that live in a country that they have to leave because of their ethnicity. Why? You can't conflate. I know that they're all brown, but you can't say they're all the same.
There's certain beliefs and ideals that a society should hold up.
Like not forcibly deporting people from a country that they've existed in for multiple generations? I'm just asking, why does Israel care about the ethnic composition of the country? That's the question. Now you're talking about Zionism? That's the question.
That's literally the same thing, Stephen.
It's literally not, but okay.
It is literally the same thing, right? Again, I don't know why you're having so much trouble keeping track of this, but this is a very simple
Hold on,
point.
to be clear, I'm not having trouble keeping track of this. We can talk about a Jewish nation. We can talk about Theodore Herzl. We can talk about the foundational ideas of Zionism all you want. What I'm asking is right now for today, why does Israel want to maintain the ethnic character of their country? That's it. The ethnic character of the country is important to Israeli people, especially Jewish ones, because they feel like if they were to live as an ethnic minority, that the history would be repeated that they'd experienced in every other part of the world, and they would be subject to pogroms or mass violence like they had been historically. Israel doesn't face any real security threats. That's a quote from Zionists. I don't think Israel faces real security threats today. Obviously, terror attacks and whatnot can happen, but not things that threaten the territorial integrity of Israel is what I mean. Maybe the more reasonable route would be to acknowledge that there are a lot of problems that exist today due to a wide variety of reasons. Why not focus on addressing the problems like the collapse of communities or the loss of religion or institutions in our country?
I see these things as intertwined with you.
Most Muslims and most Arabs in the Middle East would tell you, yeah, f them. We don't want them to have equal rights. They don't deserve it. But, they're blaming it on Israel now. A lot of them would say, no, these people, we don't want them here. There's nothing racially essentialized about that. If you're ethnocentric and you're basing your values on the race of somebody, I would argue that, yeah, of course you're racist. That's like the definition of being racist. You can't just keep crying, oh, you're being racist. Oh, you're being racist.
Why do you assume there's some racist intent behind this?
Because we're having a discussion about an ethno-state. So you would say that advocating for an ethno-state is not necessarily an extremist position?
Nope.
Okay. I mean, I disagree. I would consider anything advocating ethno-states to be pretty extremist, but I don't know what you're arguing for. I don't think you've existed in reality.
You don't know what I'm arguing for? I don't know how it possibly could have been more clear that I think that what Israel is doing counts as apartheid and ethnic cleansing, and it's wrong for the United States to support that. I don't know how I could have been more clear on that. I realize that you prefer to talk about anything but that's my position. Yeah, so, oh, Andy, I think you're muted. Okay. Yeah, I can't unmute you. You have to unmute yourself. In any case, while we're sorting that out, yeah, this is thought this is a pretty striking compilation. And so, when I saw this, I tweeted it out. That's the Destiny Ben tweet one, graphic. And said this is a great video. Somebody put together a montage of pro-Israel talking points from his debates with me and Nathan Robinson, with eerily similar white nationalist talking points people used to throw at him back when he was debating far-right weirdos all the time. And he responded to this. He said, why do you think it would be fair to compare statements about a Western country and the expectations that country would have to a country in a totally different region of the world facing a totally different set of problems with a different history? Seriously. Which, yeah, my point in response to this is note that this works exactly as well or exactly as badly as a defense of apartheid era South Africa. Why judge it by the human rights standards of Western countries? Totally different region of the world. And, in fact, this is, sorry, I just laughing at the chat for anybody who's wanting to listen to this is the audio podcast later. But yeah, this is in fact something that if you go back and look at a lot of the things that right wingers were saying about South Africa in the 1980s, this was a fairly common talking point. Look, there are all these other African countries with all these human rights abuses. Why are you always just talking, about this one, right? It's unfair to single them out. Really, this is just like a Soviet talking point or blah, 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 right? Like there was tons of this stuff at the time. And, that I'll note, we await his reply to.
Yeah, I mean, I like how he says seriously, as if like it's like so ridiculous. You know what I mean? I think like you would really have to show that the context is radically different, right? For things like ethno-states or ethnic cleansing to be wrong. I can't imagine a context in which those things are right. I was curious though, because some people were calling him dumb. He doesn't seem dumb to me. Do you know if he did like debate in high school? Not to cast aspersions on all people who did, high school or middle school debate or whatever it is. He doesn't seem dumb. He just seems like he's just arguing whatever the fuck he has to argue in the moment to win whatever side he picked. Do you know what I mean? Like, I feel like my criticism of him is he just doesn't seem very principled, to be honest with you. Not that he has a intellectual capacity. It seems like he's quite good in going in rhetorical circles, when he wants to be, and that's why he's amassed an audience. Not to say that dumb people can't amass a big audience, considering some of the clips we were just analyzing and some of the clips we just put out. But he seems like he's just saying whatever the fuck he has to. Like when literally like he could have gotten his points right before, like you do in a debate. You have to argue yes or no, and you have to plan for both. But I don't think that's just not what we're interested in. We're interested in like figuring out what principles we actually have. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
I don't believe him.
But yeah, it does take a smart person to play Minecraft while doing that. So credit where credit's due.
Good multitasker. Is that what he did?
Yes.
Yeah. I've never thought he was dumb. I think that he has. He probably did do debate in high school. I actually did debate for a year in high school. The 1994 to 95 East Lansing High School debate team when I was a freshman in high school. Fun piece of historical trivia. Nate Silver was also on the 94-95 East Lansing High School debate too.
Wow, that's stacked. That's stacked. That's like finding out that like 2 NBA players were on the same like summer.
It's like the dream team of the Olympics, you know.
But yeah, in any case, like, yeah, I do think that like kind of my critique of the guy is, I mean, part of this is just like, I mean, I have known would be an exaggeration, but right, I've had some level of interaction with him or been at least sort of aware of what his deal was since, 2019 at least. I did 2 debates with him then. There was one that was just kind of on his stream about socialism, and there was one that was about rent control that was on the serfs. And, kind of back then, my 2019 take on Destiny was that he seemed like there were days where it seemed like he actually wasn't that bad politically. Like maybe he was just sort of at heart was some sort of like cautious social democrat. And there were days when it seemed like he was like the world's most annoying centrist. And there was a time when I definitely would have given him credit for like at least trying to sort of follow the arguments where they led. That's not really my impression anymore, to be honest. I think that like beyond, like, so I think my critique beyond the fact that there are certain things that he manages to miss that I think are sort of mind-bogglingly obvious, or they should be, right? Like, which doesn't mean that he's dumb. I think he just kind of has some ideological blinkers on some issues. So like, that the sort of insistence on burying the Israel-Palestine stuff under this mountain of trivia and kind of ignoring the sort of core normative point about like, is it actually okay to treat people this way? Could anything justify treating people this way, right? Keeping them as non-citizen subjects for decade after decade after decade. But I think that like, I think there are 2 things going on here. One is an ideological blinker thing, which is that, and I think this has always kind of driven a lot of his reaction to the left, that I think anything that just strikes him as far enough away from what people who seem reasonable think that like, it just seems like, like that just seems silly to him. Right. So I think like any talk about like socialism or Marxism or anything like that, I think that just seems silly to him because it seems like so far from what the capital S, capital P serious people think. And I think you see a lot of that in his Israel-Palestine commentary too, that is like, well, look, whatever Bill Clinton said, all these, like that the sort of establishment consensus-y view of foreign policy just can't be completely wrong. I think that's part of it. And then I think part of it, I think what's kind of coming off, I think what you're sort of identifying is very unprincipled, and really what comes out in that montage is that, yeah, there is something that's like a little bit lawyerly about this, a little bit of like, kind of, I'll just sort of pick a side and, and like say whatever I can come up with that makes the most sense on that. But what I see as driving that is just that I think he's gotten way too driven by his irritations. Like, like whatever faction of people online is like annoying him the most. Right, like he's sort of very dedicated to showing that they're wrong about everything.
He'd be the first. No one else has ever gotten irritation pilled. That's like, I feel like that happens to like over half of people on Twitter to some degree, right? Just becoming like whoever's in your mentions being the most annoying. You spend too much time trying to, Or you just become biased against that opinion, whoever is irritated.
No, exactly, right?
Yeah.
Like, I think it happens all the time. I think that people, I think that he sort of represents a very streamery version of it.
Sure.
Right, but like, I think in all sorts of ways, I think it happens all the time. I mean, I look at the way, various people, fill in the blank. You're all smart people watching this. Various people will get like super annoyed at liberals for reasons that, I'm sympathetic to. That like, I think the people that they're annoyed by are in fact annoying, and they'll react to that by moving to the right or moving to ambiguously sort of the right in some weird contrarian way.
You know what's the best with that shit though is when they come back because their new right-wing fans annoy them. Like I've been seeing that, and then they're like, and then they kind of are like, they kind of become left. I've been seeing that with some of these people now. They're sort of left-wing again because they're like, oh, these guys, they don't care about free speech either. Like, you know what I mean? So it's
yeah. No, I mean that's kind of the best case scenario, that they like come back around because they realize that everything that they were reacting to, in the left, is there at least as bad. And then look, I also see like people who are like sort of lib policy wonks who get really annoyed at the leftists in their mentions, and then like that leads them to, I think, somewhat lose track of whatever it was that they actually cared about in the first place, right? Like all these people, I mean, like I saw this a lot in like the 2016 and 20 elections, people who for years had been on record as being like, yeah, we should obviously have single payer healthcare, like who are suddenly like, wow, this Bernie single payer thing isn't really realistic, right? Because they're being negatively polarized by whoever was calling them a sellout all day in their mentions. So yeah, I mean, I think it's very, very easy to do that. I think it's very, it's very easy to like be so annoyed and disgusted by the right wing, quite correctly, that you end up just like tailing whatever libs are saying about whatever bullshit is happening in the news that day. And like, that, I mean, that's actually maybe the least bad of the options we've been talking about, but it's also not great in its own way. Right. And again, people can fill in whatever names for each of these they want to in their heads. But in any case, I would argue that you're much better off just you're much better off just kind of starting with, okay, what are the values that I care about, and what's my analysis of the world, which gets us into Cohen and Karl Marx's theory of history, and doing your best to go forward from there rather than just reacting to the people that you don't like on the internet, because if you're putting a plus wherever those people you don't like on the internet are putting a minus, you're going to end up in some really weird, unpleasant places.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely better also to do it based on who you talk to in real life, but I've seen like maybe kind of an inverse version in real life. Maybe you've seen this in left spaces where it's like, I changed my mind because I was organizing and I talked to a ton of people on the ground, and I have to be with where the people are. You know what I mean? As opposed to like, it's kind of like a deference. I have to defer. I used to be for X position, now I'm for Y position because I really, I listened. And it's like, I think it's good to take people's opinion and change your mind. But like, I feel like you said, at the end of the day, it's like you have your own principles. You know what I mean? Or you should, and you could adjust, but like you kind of have to make up your own mind on things. You can't just either react because someone's annoying you, or be like, I finally met someone who like the real people on the ground who feel a certain way. Because I mean, kind of like this whole thing with like Biden dropping out. You know what I mean? There was like a tweet that said like, the black churches are supporting Biden, so we got to stick with Biden now. And it's like, well, if you actually poll,
if you actually look at polls, like 55-60% of black voters want Biden to drop out, which is pretty similar to all the other racial demographics.
It's good to have your own foundation, I guess.
No,
to your point.
No, you're right. You should. And look, I mean, that doesn't mean you don't. Like I actually think what you're describing with the on the ground organizing stuff is pretty healthy, but
it can be. It depends how you do it. Yeah.
The healthy version of it isn't, oh, I cared about this and I'm just going to flip to the other side because I realized that's politically convenient, right? Like, it's like, look, these are the values that I care about. This seemed to me like a way we could do that, but then I realized, right, like the sort of coalition of people that we need to do that, right? Like, isn't there. So we're just gonna so we need to kind of go back to the drawing board and like figure out something that we can actually mobilize like a winning coalition for. I think that's totally reasonable.
Perfect.
But like
yeah.
that's ideally, in fact, something that should happen. But again, the guiding thing, right, is because it's like, yeah, I mean, surely it wouldn't be like, oh, well, I used to think racial diversity was good. Then I knocked on a bunch of doors and talked to a bunch of racists, and like now I realize we should have an ethno state, right? Like,
and the people who are saying that would never budge on that kind of issue. Do you know what I mean? It's like it's always to like make an excuse for some policy thing. I feel like.
Yeah. So I mean, it wouldn't be that, right? It would be like, well, like the values I care about are the values that I care about, but like my sort of abstract analysis of how we can go forward sort of ran up against the wall of here's the community we'd actually need to mobilize to get behind.
That's good. Yeah, that's good shit. Yeah.
Yeah, that's all good stuff. That you should do. Okay. So gonna bring on Matthew McManus in coming to us from Detroit Rock City. How you doing, Matt?
I got no complaints.
Good. Yeah, I saw you shared on Twitter earlier. I saw some fan mail from somebody who was like, "Oh, look at this radical college professor living in the who's like saying all this stuff about how because you were reading Pat Buchanan's book, I think, because that's the kind of thing you do." And you
and by the way, it's shit. If anybody wants to know, right? And I mean, not horse shit, like serious bullshit, like levels of shittiness.
Shocking.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm so sorry.
So in
one of us has to bear the cross.
In Pat Buchanan's book, he said he had some weird convoluted explanation for why German immigrants were fine, but not Mexican immigrants. And you'd which is also funny because Pat's a Catholic, and you'd think anyway, whatever.
Well, but he says, it might be more Christian to turn the other cheek, and it might be more Christian to actually conciliate with other civilizations. But we also have to be sensible, right? And realize the strong do as they will, and the weak suffer what they must, which is a very Christian idea. And we have to be the strong, right? So that's Pat's philosophy in a nutshell, right? He's Catholic until not so much anymore.
I mean, I was just thinking, like, if we're talking about cultural similarities, right? The Mexican immigrants are less likely to be Protestants than the German immigrants. But in any case,
well, that's why the race thing is really telling for me, right? Like, you run it down, and it's like, well, we have more in common with Germans. It's like, what you have more fucking in common with people living in a democratic state right next door who are predominantly Christian and who fucking consume American TV and cultural products like they're going out of fashion. I think that actually the motivation behind why you want Germans rather than Mexicans is a little bit different than maybe what he intimates at points. And then very nicely just comes along and he's like, well, Germans don't belong to the same race as Latinos, but they do belong to the same race as us, so that's why we want them. And you're like, oh, thank God. At least we're being upfront about this, right? We don't have to wade through any more of this fucking bullshit anymore, because as anybody who spends a lot of time reading far-right literature knows, God, do they love to be politically correct until they don't anymore.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of funny. Like, as we're having this conversation, drinking the coffee out of this Friday the 13th mug that I bought in Mexico, because you see shit like this sold here all the time. So there's definitely a lot of cultural, synergy there. But in any case, yeah. So I saw the fan who did the above and beyond the call thing that I always love, where they track down like a university email address to send you your thoughts that way. Said, oh, look at this like white lefty college professor, who lives in a white college town. He's saying everybody else should just accept, living with Mexican immigrants. And, I live in Los Angeles, buddy. Could you imagine trading places with me? Which, the
hard streets of gated communities in Los Angeles. Let's be clear about that, right?
Yeah. Which is just, also particularly funny because I think when I met you, you were living in Mexico.
I was. And you know what? I was living in lower middle class Mexico. A lot of places that are dangerous there. I have to say that, right? But it's a wonderful place with wonderful people, right? And one of the things that I really fucking find so funny about these types is how they're all kind of just little bitches when you boil it down, right? Like, you're like, no, I can't go to a place where there might be people with skin color that's not mine because I'm too afraid and I'm too worried and I might get robbed. And it's like, fuck you. I thought you were supposed to be like this whole warrior ethic type where you fear nothing, right? I mean, really, when you boil it down, all of them are like Curtis Yarvin, right? Curtis will go to fucking Naples in Italy, and the first thing he'll say is like, I just felt really unsafe, right? Yeah, nothing bad happened, but everywhere I went, I just felt really, really, really afraid. And we can't have that, right? Which is why we should institute an authoritarian government, because that'll make people a lot less afraid. Like, stop being little fucking cowards and grow a pair of balls. That's my fucking philosophy on that.
Yeah, I like it. Whatever went in Matt's coffee this morning, I want more of it.
Yes. Starbucks caramel, right?
Also, of course, you literally live in Detroit now, which, this is a deep cut sociological fact, is not a predominantly white city. But
no, hey, Detroit's great. I mean, you were here with me not too long ago.
No, I mean, look, I've always liked Detroit. But yeah, so I do want to I did want to cover a couple things before we get into the main event for tonight. So one of them is one of them I thought would be good to do while you're on air, which is that I wrote an article for Jacobin that came out a few days ago that's called "Democracy Requires Disempowering the Supreme Court." That basically it's a very makes a very simple argument that we've kind of gotten to the point where what's generally treated as like the sober, realist, reasonable position is sort of weirdly utopian on its own terms, which is that like you could have some kind of meaningful, and I mean, I'm not even talking about like socialism here, but just some sort of like substantive left liberal agenda, but also keep the Supreme Court exactly the way it is. And just like, I don't know, maybe, Democrats will win every election for the next 30 years. So, you'll eventually go from having the 6-3 super conservative majority back to having a liberal majority. And I think a lot's happened, in the last few weeks that should splash some cold water on that.
Yeah, just to interject, we found out you could fucking buy a Supreme Court justice. Like, there's only 9 of those. That's really impressive that the billionaires figured out that they're actually for sale, right? You think that there'd be one thing that could have commodified, but I suppose Marx is just right? When you live in a neoliberal capitalist society, eventually everything becomes commodified, even justice.
Yeah, I mean, we like the fact that the Supreme Court doesn't actually have a binding code of ethics with some sort of procedure to enforce it has gotten a lot more embarrassing lately, since all the stuff about Clarence Thomas in particular has come out, which is, by the way, amazing that there's a documentary from a few years ago where Thomas actually says things like, "Oh, I don't really like going to fancy places.
Yeah.
I like, I like the people you mean like Walmart parking lots." Like, man, it's good that he's just willing to, do a solid for his friends and go on yacht trips around the world with them. That like what he would really prefer to be hanging out in the Walmart parking lot. But
you remember, Ben, you go on that road trip with the boys and your $250,000 fucking trailer with, the ventilation in the bathroom and the fucking just the kind of thing that normal people do, right? And then once you're done, you get out, you relax a little bit, you get in the private jet that takes you to the $50,000 a day golf course. It's all real fucking salt of the earth kind of shit, right?
Yeah, no, that's fair enough, right? It's like, look, maybe not every activity that you do on your road trip with the boys is what you would have wanted, but that doesn't matter, right? Like, that's like,
got compromise.
Are we gonna take the gigantic boat, literally called a super yacht, to Thailand. It's like, I get it. That's what you guys really want to do.
He's the broke guy in the bachelor trip. I feel for him. He's like, guys, I can't afford the boat this time. They're like, no, we got you. We just want you to come.
I mean, I will say this about Clarence, right? I heard that he's taken $3 million in gifts apparently since starting on the SCOTUS. And it's kind of like when I found out that fucking Tiger Woods had slept with like 50 different women in the course of his marriage. I lost respect for him, and then it just kind of didn't quite shoot up again, but it's just kind of like, God fucking damn, you just didn't give a shit at all, right? You might as well just fucking set up a Patreon and be like, hey, Harlan, right? You want justice, right? Right there, just click, I could do with a cool 100,000 or so, and we'll see what decision we can come up with that. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. Like, just doesn't give two fucks at all.
Yeah. Well, the charitable interpretation is that he just does all this stuff because he's a diehard ideologue, which I don't actually think is better, but because it would still be the case that you have somebody with a lifetime appointment and obviously no fear of public opinion, who is one of the 9 people who is empowered to overturn democratically passed laws. And again, like, however you explain the current makeup of the court, like the last few weeks, we've seen, the two big attention grabbing ones were very big. A third one I talk about in the article is one a couple weeks ago that got much less attention, but I think is pretty significant, which was about several Starbucks employees who had been fired allegedly for violating trivial company policies nobody's ever fired for, but pretty obviously for their union involvement. And Starbucks was ordered by the National Labor Relations Board to reinstate their jobs. They took them to court, eventually got up to the Supreme Court, and basically there's this there's a little bit of a complicated issue with 2 different standards that federal judges have used to evaluate these requests. And one of them is, one of them is higher than the other. And the Supreme Court said, and actually this one was just about unanimous. There was like, I think Ketanji Brown Jackson had like a partial dissent. But they pretty much unanimously sided with the union busters and said, no, you have to use the higher standards. So the NLRB can't order people being reinstated unless you can show irreparable harm from not getting your job back. So if you don't have that, if you don't meet that standard, you just have to wait however long it's going to take to get your day in court, to get your job back, which could be years. Very often is years, right? So that's the kind of thing. And, I just really want to note that's like, this is like really worth highlighting, because this is not one of the high profile 6-3 fiery dissents, attention grabbing ones. This is just kind of business as usual at the Supreme Court. And it's kind of what you should expect, because if you just told somebody who'd never heard of this institution before, oh yeah, we have this like panel of 9 Harvard and Yale graduates with lifetime appointments who get to decide, which laws stay and which ones go. But it's like, yeah, what does that sound like? Like, whose interest do you think that they're going to serve just on the face of it, right? And then if that's the baseline, the 2 really attention-grabbing ones, which were 6-3 split, fiery dissent, kinds of rulings, were really incredible. So on the one hand, they struck down Chevron deference, which is a doctrine that's existed for 40 years that basically says that regulatory agencies have pretty wide latitude to interpret the regulations they enforce, which is important because corporate lawyers have always hated this because they want to be able to tie up the regulators in court all the time. And the other one says that if presidents commit crimes that in the context of performing official acts, then you can impeach them for it. But if they're not impeached, for example, you find about it later, then they're just immune. the courts aren't allowed to touch it. So putting these together, it seems like we have a situation where you have an executive branch that has very little power to regulate corporate America, but is still headed by somebody who theoretically could, like, I don't know, order a drone strike on an American city and be totally immune from future prosecution for doing it because it was an official act. And, it seems like the picture is pretty bleak.
Yeah, some people might call that a king, and some might also suggest that this country was founded by trying to get rid of kings. But what do I know? I'm a Canadian, right? Actually, just to your point, I want to say I really liked your article, Ben, in no small part because it overlaps with a lot of what I teach about the Constitution. But I'm very pleased to say that there's a lot of really good literature that's coming out of the left on just these topics right now. And some of it is quite a bit more substantive than what we've seen in a long time. So just by way of kind of personal exegesis, when I was studying law back in my undergrad and during my master's, the kind of supposition about American law was once upon a time there was a good progressive court. It was called the Warren Court. This is more or less the way things should be or would be normally, but we've just deviated from that a little bit. And what we need to do is get the court back on course. This was the kind of argument that extremely smart and bright constitutional theorists like Ronald Dworkin, for example, put forward in a number of different books. What you're seeing now, though, is a much more, I think, clear-eyed and realistic appraisal of the role that the SCOTUS has played in American history by people like, say, Aziz Rana, author of a great book that everyone should read called The Constitutional Bind, or, Samuel Moyne or Adam Cohen, not G.A. Cohen, Adam Cohen, his book Supreme Inequality. And what all of these authors point out is that if you look at the court's history over about 250 years, there's really only been 15 years of the SCOTUS's history where it's even vaguely served progressive purposes or advanced a kind of liberal approach to jurisprudence. For the rest of that history, pretty uniformly, it's been a reactionary body, and it's issued some real bangers in that time. If you think about the Dred Scott decision or the Plessy versus Ferguson decision that upheld separate but equal, all the way down to the current era where
or even just like the sort of rulings that it was doing pretty routinely in the early decades of the 20th century.
Absolutely.
Like against where they were like striking down laws against child labor and things like that.
Yeah, the Lochner decision, lives on in infamy, right? And what all these authors kind of iterate is that, to invoke Rana, Americans, particularly liberals, need to get over this kind of creedal constitutionalism is the term that Rana uses. This idea that the Constitution is fine and American laws are fine and the American court system is fine. We just need to get them back on track because they've been co-opted from conservatives. What Rana and all these authors point out is no, right? In many ways, the reactionary court is doing what the Supreme Court has done for most of American history, which is uphold the interests of the kind of people who spend a lot of time at Yale and love Harvard. And I hate to break it to you, those aren't typically working class people who are working cashier jobs, right? And the reason why they're putting this forward, I think, to your observation, is that we can't just be sitting there as leftists and say, well, we just need to replace people on the court and then things will be better. Yeah. We'll go back to the Warren Court heyday. We need to have a fundamental rethinking of the role that the court plays in American politics and ask ourselves whether it's really the most sensible thing to have one of the most powerful bodies in the country and indeed in the world being able to dictate what the interpretation of the basic law of the land is going to be rather than the people themselves.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. I mean, like, honestly, the article ends with talking about some like pretty incremental kinds of reforms like term limits, court packing. But I certainly look, I would be in favor of going a lot further than that. I would note that most Western democracies don't have anything like the kind of strong judicial review that we have in the U.S., where the court has like this incredibly wide latitude to just throw out laws, and then there's like no second opinion after they've made their decision. That it's just throw, like Canada, for example, doesn't have that, right? Like that's most liberal democracies don't have anything like that, and I would definitely be in favor of moving away from that. But even short of that, even those sorts of like small fixes like expansion and term limits, I think are things that tend to somewhat diminish the autonomy of the institution, because you don't get, you don't just get this tiny number of people who are there forever and know that, like, you know, the rules are that just like until one of them dies, there's nothing anybody can do about it. So, you know, I think those things tend to at least be baby steps in the right direction. But I did have, and yeah, I know you've written and thought a lot about these issues and in your academic work. So that's why I wanted to have you on for that conversation. But I do have one more, much more serious topic to broach with you before we go to the main subject for tonight, which is that I saw that you'd had a run-in on Twitter with maybe the foremost you know, scholar of our era. They actually call him Conceptual James.
That's right.
So
wow, he must be really intelligent to earn a name like that.
Oh, Jimmy James is a big brain guy, that's for sure, right? You can see that on any clip where, you know, he's talking about communofascism and how it's going to take over the world, and the way that it's going to do that is by grooming kindergartners to wear rainbow-colored clothes, right? Deep level stuff that you really need to sit there and dwell in a little bit, not even to understand, just to begin to understand. It's important.
Yeah, I remember I had like a year or two ago, I had Lillian Sakarici on, and I played her in GTA style one of those clips of Lindsay talking about communofascism.
That's so fucking,
you know, and then like I just remember after it was done, she was like, what? I don't know what I'm supposed to do with this.
I'm a person of medium moral virtue, as I like to point out. Sometimes high moral virtue, so, you know, I kind of deserve that. But Lillian's a nice person. She doesn't fucking deserve to be subjected to goddamn James Lindsay. I wouldn't fucking subject James Lindsay on Ben Shapiro.
Well, fair enough. So let's take a look at this. I should say that the prehistory of this exchange is that another friend of the show, Jordan Peterson, had posted some rant about what he called the Luciferian nature of Marxism. And, you know, you pointed out that, you know, that Peterson talks a lot about Marxism for somebody who seems to have read very little Marx. And I think you also made the point that there's something a little bit funny about the rant about Marxism being Luciferian, given Peterson's famously far greater respect for and actually often very admiring mentions of Friedrich Nietzsche, who you know, one of his books is literally called The Antichrist, and it's not a denunciation, but in response to that, you got some you know, Peterson super fans going at you, and one of them mentioned James Lindsay, and so this is not exactly a bomb-throwing tweet, but you'd responded to that by saying yes. And as we make clear here, it's a link to an article called Race Marxism. That's one of James Lindsay's books. I love that title. James Lindsay is also not an authority to be trusted on these matters, or even when discussing classical liberalism, ironically, to which Lindsay responded, showing why they call him Conceptual James. You stupid fraud.
Yeah. Which was really fucking ironic also, because the whole prompt for this conversation was the guy saying, well, you know, leftists don't actually know how to argue with us. They just call us stupid. And he was referring to, you know, the way that I talked about Jordan Peterson. So I retweeted something from our book, Ben, Myth and Mayhem, being like, look, we've never called Peterson stupid. Actually, at the front of the book, I called him a really smart guy. Then he freaked out, tagged in Conceptual James, and what's the fucking first thing that Jimmy says? You fucking stupid fraud. Fuck you. You know what I mean? I'm like, oh, just the fucking big guns the right is bringing out today. The really difficult kind of arguments that make me shit myself because I don't know how to respond to them. Right.
I should also say that in the course of all these people being like, oh, you're just calling people dumb. And you pointed out, right, that you and I and Marianne and Conrad had written this book called Myth and Mayhem, a leftist critique of Jordan Peterson. So clearly we're taking him seriously, right? We did a whole book responding to the arguments, and people started to be like, yeah, here's the part of the book where you're calling him dumb. And so what they picked out was a couple paragraphs of the book that I think started with, well, but Peterson doesn't know any of this. He says blah, 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 right? And the two things that were funny to me about this, one, he's clearly not being called dumb in that passage. He's just being called wrong. And two, they didn't glance at the table of contents first because I fucking wrote that part, right? I mean, that wasn't even you, right? Like, it was like, oh, you're calling me, Peterson dumb. It's like, no, that's literally a quote from the essay that I wrote for that book.
I know, man. It's like fucking, you can't even get authorial attribution right. Come on, right? I mean, if you're going to tag fucking concept, at least fucking put in the effort to figure out who wrote something, right? If you're going to try to make the claim that, classical liberals take intellectual seriousness with a great deal more severity than people on the left, right? But just to go back to that Myth and Mayhem book, I'm still pretty happy with what a lot of what we wrote there. The kind of irony is, at the time where I pitched that book, it was partly because I figured that Jordan Peterson was going to become something like a Roger Scruton or Patrick Deneen type conservative intellectual, right? Somebody who obviously I would disagree with a lot, but who was a serious intellectual who offered considerable or formidable arguments against the left, and we'd have to respond to them. And boy, oh boy, was I wrong about that, right? What we got instead was a guy talking about commie cum factories that are going to fucking just drain the semen out of guys in order to bring about their kind of woke utopia, right? So the motivation behind the book seems a little anachronistic right now, but I still feel pretty proud of what we put out.
No, I mean, I'm very happy about that book. It is a little bit funny, actually. I think another thing people were objecting to in that page that they thought you wrote, that I wrote, was that I'd used the word histrionics. And gotta say, in the few years since then, the man has not gotten less hysterical.
Yeah, like that was the other thing. Like, if the term histrionic doesn't apply to someone calling Marx literally Luciferian without ever fucking having read any of his work, then God, I don't know what is. And what kind of offends me about this is I've read probably all of Peterson's major work at this point. Certainly all of his books, most of his papers, lectures, and all this stuff. I read Maps of Meaning twice, right? It's so fucking obnoxious that they would be railing against me and you and others for this when he can't even fucking be bothered to go through more than a 20-page pamphlet by Marx, and yet still sees absolutely fit to inveigh about shit that he clearly doesn't have any understanding of, right? Like I said to the guy at the end of this whole exchange, and Jimmy, right? Just hold yourself to the fucking standard of a first-year undergrad, right? Like, if you fucking handed in an essay that didn't even bother citing any primary sources and your response was, well, my gut tells me it's wrong, you'd fucking fail, and you'd fail hard. And they can't even meet that really, really, really basic standard when it comes to evaluating this stuff. And it's just so offensive.
Yeah.
And lazy.
Yeah. So when you made that point, Lowell, I'm not the one who wrote an entire book of the subject without marshaling any real arguments against James, who says your entire life as a critical theorist is writing on subjects without marshaling any real arguments against them. So I repeat myself, you stupid fraud. So look, got to give the guy credit. I assume he's read all 7 of your books. He's gone back and he's, what are you up to? Like 50 articles in Jacobin. I assume James has read all of
49,
those.
very soon.
And he's realized, and he's like earned his opinion, and he's decided that there are no real arguments in any of those books or articles or essays. I disagree, but whatever, man's entitled to his opinion. Yeah, I like 2 things about that name, Race Marxism, James Lindsay's book. One of them is, of course, that it it actually manages the impressive trick of making it sound like something that'll be written by somebody actually much worse than James Lindsay is.
That's true.
And I think James Lindsay is pretty bad, but that title makes it sound like that would be like, that would like be from like Waffen 1488 press, right?
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
But 2, just the sort of basic premise is so fucking stupid that it's like, oh, well, see, if you think about it, critical race theory is like Marxism because Marxism says that workers, or I don't know, we haven't bothered to read enough about Marx to know exactly what it says, but it says that like workers are treated badly in some way or another. Good enough, right? So, and this talks about oppression, not of workers, but whatever, right? some group being oppressed by some group, right? So it's like it's essentially Marxism if you do it's essentially Marxism if you do some global search word and replaces in the Word document, which is amazing. It kind of reminds me of Karl Popper is obviously somebody who I think deserves much more respect than James Lindsay, but he did say something that was like really silly along similar lines in The Open Society and Its Enemies, where he like quotes something by Hegel and says, "Oh, if you substitute in race for like whatever it is that Hegel says, right, this could be a Nazi thing." I remember Walter Kaufman has something where he's talking about this, like, yeah, and if you substitute in, love the Aryan race for love your brothers and your sisters, and like quotations from Jesus, those sound really bad, right? Like, what does that prove, right? But also like just the basic idea. It's like, oh well, you're talking about one group being oppressed by another group, so even if it's not the same group and you're not saying the same thing about it, this is essentially Marxism. One of your co-hosts on Academic Edgelords, Ethan, always has a great line about this, which is like, yeah, you might as well call libertarianism state Marxism.
Yeah, Ethan's good that way. Yeah, I will say, to their credit, I do love how fucking many different flavors of Marxism they come up with without ever having to bother reading anything by Marx, right? It's really pretty impressive how you can have so many opinions about things while knowing jack shit about it. I mean, at this point, we're at meta-Marxism, race Marxism, American Marxism, cultural Marxism, Judeo-Bolshevik Marxism, right? I even saw Peterson the other day be like meta-postmodern Marxism, and I'm like, good God, what the fuck is that, right? It's really, really kind of awe-inspiring, and it's a lot of fun. I mean, don't get me wrong.
I kind of want, okay, at this point, we could surely get an AI to do the scene from Forrest Gump where the guy's listing off all the kinds of shrimp, but for Marxisms.
Yeah. Well, that's it, right? And the other thing too is like, look, if there really are so many fucking kinds of Marxism in society, then boy, oh boy, did we ever win the Cold War, hands down, right? Because apparently everything from fucking Disney to like Big Cola is a Marxist company right now. So let's just rewrite the history books and be like, look, communism won. It wasn't even really a fair fight, and it's over now, right? We'll just all concede on this. But Lindsay's book is, I will say, not the worst of these kinds of hyphenate Marxism books that I've read. That still belongs to Levin's American Marxism, hands down, right? But it's still pretty fucking bad, right? Like when you open a book by being like critical theorists are really conspiratorial, and then almost immediately you're like critical theory is creeping into like every school and every small and every movie theater, and it's right behind me right now. Where are the critical theorists? You're like, I think that actually you might be projecting a little bit, fucking James. And the other thing that really bothered me about it is any reasonably acute fourth year undergrad, again, knows that if you're going to write about a topic critically, then you got to actually have some fucking criticisms, right? You got to sit there at the end and be like, hey, now that I've summarized this, here's my argument against this. Jimmy is so goddamn lazy that he doesn't have anything to say about this. He's just like, well, actually, if you think about it, Marx is kind of a Gnostic thinker who didn't have anything to say about economics, despite actually writing 2 books with subtitles called A Critique of Political Economy, or even just the overt fucking title, right? It's like, okay, I guess if I snorted enough cocaine, maybe I'd come up with the conclusion that Marx was a Gnostic thinker either. But unfortunately, I just didn't have that much fun when I was younger, and I can't really reach that conclusion.
Well, look, I lived in Miami for 6.5 years, but even I haven't been able to reach that conclusion. So, fill in the rest of that sentence however you want. But in any case, I do want to get to the main event, talking about not race Marxism, not gender Marxism, not state Marxism, not Gnostic Marxism, not Walmart Marxism, but Marxism. I will see you guys, Jake and Andy, at the end of the show. We're not doing a post game tonight, but we were going to do a quick toast because the 30,000 subscribers. But
congratulations, by the way, to all of you. I'm really happy about that, and it's really fucking phenomenal to see such a great milestone for all your works.
Oh, thank you. So let's see. To transition from James Lindsay to G.A. Cohen, I was thinking about somebody who's maybe not in the James Lindsay tier of brilliance, but
who is
but he's getting there. Charlie Kirk, who, when I debated him a few years ago, this came up, and I actually we sort of end up spending this very odd minute talking about Karl Marx's theory of history, and I kind of tried to do like an accessible 20-second version of like what analytical Marxism is. So we can see how I did, and then get into GTAA Cohen. Jake, do we have that clip?
I want to ask you and I want to get more into philosophy here. What's your view of Karl Marx?
My view of Karl Marx is pretty positive. I think that you can certainly find things like anybody who's writing in the mid-19th century that, if there's nothing that you think is wrong about 150 years later, then like something has gone very wrong, right? There should be ways that you can say, no, this part no longer makes sense. You got to rethink that. I think you have to look at it a la carte, but I think that Karl Marx is a basically positive figure. I think that the theory of history is mostly right, and I also, I see you smiling. Happy to get into it.
I'm happy to debate the Hegelian dialectic and the phenomenology of spirit.
Oh, okay.
No, not debate it. We can discuss it.
Not where I thought this was going, but that's cool.
That's basically what you mean by the theory of history,
I don't think it is. I think there's a big difference there.
He was the head of the young Hegelians.
Yeah.
Actually, if you read his book, The College Scam, he's literally the president of the Young Hegelians, who were a club. We can't forget that, right? It was an official title that they passed around, and Marx was the beneficiary of that honor for a couple of years. Many people don't know that.
Yeah, I certainly didn't know that, and still don't. That's amazing. I love the idea of the Young Hegelian, like the philosophical school, right? The Young Hegelian had a president. I want to know how you campaigned for that office, like what the procedure was, if there was like a...
Well, I think it's pretty obvious. You sit there and you're like, we're going to fucking complete the system of German idealism, and we're going to do it over copious rounds of drinks at the bar, right? Guarantee you, hands down, you'll win. Landslide.
Fair enough. Well, it gives something to aspire to in life. Well, I wanted to talk about Karl Marx's theory of history, both the actual theory of history and the book entitled Karl Marx's Theory of History by Gerald Cohen. Karl Marx's Theory of History, Defense, I should say, is the full title of the book, which I thought might be an interesting thing for us to talk about for a couple reasons. So I had seen you post about it recently, and I should also say part of the context here is that you and I are co-editing a collection of essays for Palgrave Macmillan about Cohen. I think when we originally pitched it, we were going to call it No Bullshit Socialism, and that the suits at Palgrave drew the line at no bullshit in the title.
It's a shame too, because I still stand by that being a really memorable title. Like, I'm happy with the more academic-y one we have, and showing stuff, but No Bullshit Socialism is just more fun.
Yeah, I think now it's called was it Analytical Marxism and Democratic Socialism in the 21st century, which is fine, but yes, would have liked the original title, but in any case, I'm not going to do a whole thing about this. I've certainly talked about the guy in the show many times, but Cohen is perhaps the most important figure in a certain kind of Marxism in the late 20th and early 21st century, which is analytical Marxism, and we're going to get a little bit more, I'm sure, into what that means exactly. But a sort of big important background fact here is that, broadly speaking, right, his work falls into two main subjects, right? So there's historical materialism Cohen, which is what this book is about, right? I mean, it's probably his most important book, of any kind, but certainly the most important on this. So where he's thinking about, Marxism as a theory of history, right? So that's on the fact side of the fact value distinction. And then there's normative Cohen that he spends all this time arguing with libertarians and also arguing with sort of, left liberal kinds of thinkers like Dworkin and Rawls, from a socialist perspective. So normative Cohen is interested in like why, I guess sort of very crudely, you might think of like historical materialism. Cohen is interested in questions like, is socialism historically inevitable? And normative Cohen is interested in questions like, is socialism like morally desirable, right? Given what we think about justice. And your, the essay that you're writing for our collection, which you've already done a draft of, but I've been lucky enough to take a look at, is on the normative side of things, which is certainly, a part of Cohen that interests me, that I've written about, several times for Jacobin, all that stuff. The essay I'm writing, which this is kind of half the reason I'm doing this episode is I'm still kind of working out some of what I want to say in it, is on the historical materialism side of things. But as we're sort of getting ready to do this, I'd seen that you'd read or reread Karl Marx's Theory of History, and you'd posted about it, and you said something like, it's a fascinating book. It's sort of rich and infuriating in equal measure. Mm-hmm. And
as I should say, I think the best philosophical texts are. Just to interject briefly, Cohen has a very nice anecdote in Rescuing Justice and Equality, where he's talking about a professor at New York who every single year he would take Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit and just bash it and then bash it and then bash it and bash it. And when they did a faculty picture, he was there with a copy of the book, and somebody asked him like, "How could you do that? Right? I thought you hated that." He's like, "No, but like, what other book is there? Right? Why do you think I spend all my time reading and rereading this? Right?" So to the extent that I find Karl Marx's Theory of History a fascinating and infuriating book, it's in part because I think it's very provoking, right, in a way that a lot of lesser, but maybe less problematic philosophical texts aren't, right?
Yeah, right. So I wanted to get into this. I'm a huge apologist for that book. Taught a class on it a few years ago for the School of Social and Cultural Change, School for Social and Cultural Change, and so I wanted, if possible, right? I mean, we'll kind of see how this goes in the time that we've got today, but to do two things. One is to give people who haven't read it, right, some idea of what's in that book, and at least some flavor for some of the kinds of points that Cohen makes and a few of the central arguments, and to also kind of hash out like what you see as missing from that book, and what the aspects of it that you're critical of, which I think are is going to get us into the stuff about analytical Marxism, and to bring things right back to Charlie Kirk, Hegel. So that's if you open that up, right, the first thing you find at the beginning of the book, right, chapter 1 is called Images of History in Hegel and Marx, which is which, man, ever since I read this, I've always thought, God, I hope that nobody convinces me that Cohen is getting Hegel substantively wrong here, because I have this wonderful, intoxicating sense that I actually understand Hegel after reading this chapter, and maybe it's deceptive, and I actually don't, right? But man, I really want this to be right, because this is so clear, right? And I feel like I have a sense of at least what some of Hegel's core arguments are about the philosophy of history now. But this is maybe a good like entry point into thinking about the book, because really what Cohen is doing in that chapter is pulling out certain broad themes from Hegel that are things that are going to sort of come up in Marx's Theory of History, even though, of course, Charlie Kirk is wrong about this. Those two guys have very, very different views about history. But like, I'm trying to think about how to ask this in a way that's not insanely broad, right? But like,
well, here I have an idea, right? I think I'm just going to articulate a crude version of Cohen's theory, and a crude version. I mean, Cohen's account of what Marx is doing, and I compare it with Hegel's, right?
Sure.
On a crude reading of what Hegel is talking about, Hegel does have a kind of Marxist spirit to his theory of history, in the sense that he thinks that human powers are increasing over time, right? And with the increase of human power, so too is human freedom increasing, right? The main difference, at least on Marx's reading of Hegel and Cohen's reading of Marx's reading of Hegel, right, is that for Hegel, right, it's human cognitive powers that are increasing, right? We're coming to a richer understanding of spirit, and at a certain juncture, it's debatable when this is, we realize that this richer understanding of spirit is really just a richer understanding of ourself, right? So man becomes a question to himself for the first time, which is when we reach a level of self-consciousness that allows us to assume more control of our destiny than existed before, right? Now, many people have, needless to say, a huge number of different interpretations of this kind of Hegelian story, but it's fundamentally an optimistic story, right? About things are getting better, a kind of mature Enlightenment spirit story about human progress. Even though, as Hegel once put it, the kind of rack of human history is littered with bloodshed. It's all to this purpose of expanding human powers of cognition and consequently freedom. On kind of Cohen's reading of what Karl Marx is doing, there's a similar kind of story, right? But a materialist story where the forces of production that underpin human society are consistently improving over time. And consequently, of course, so too are our human material powers, right? Our ability to reshape the world in a way that's conducive to our interests. And the problem, of course, is that as human productive powers increase, the relations to production that kind of reside over the forces of production become, in a way, inconsistent with them, right? They're no longer able to capture all the potentialities that are latent within the forces of production. In fact, they can constrain them in certain kinds of ways. And of course, the superstructure plays a role in that as well. And from Marx's perspective, or at least Cohen's reading of Marx, when these tensions become significant enough, you have a revolutionary period where we transition from one, let's call it mode of production, or one social form to another. So from slave societies to feudal societies to capitalism. And much like Hegel thought that this was a progressive story, so too does Marx thinks this is a progressive story, except unlike Hegel, of course, Marx has an end vision in mind, right? Call it communism, call it democratic socialism, whatever you want. And we can talk about, how Cohen thought this kind of communist endpoint was going to look when we talk about his normative theorizing. But I think that's the kind of gifs of commonalities between their two outlooks.
Yeah, that's right. So I think that what Cohen emphasizes when he's talking about Hegel is this growth of human freedom over time that is tied, although in a very different way than it will be in Marx, to sort of independence from nature.
Yep.
Thinking about how this works on Hegel's version, and as you know, I mean, when I was in, when I visited you in Michigan, back in March, I actually spoke to a Hegel reading group there, and
my liver still hasn't recovered from that.
That's an off-air conversation, but and one of the first things I said was, right, is like I'm very reluctant to like actually advance opinions about what Hegel's saying, because in my experience, there's nothing that Hegel said that's like not somewhat in dispute about what it means.
Definitely
among interpreters, but certainly, Hegel talks a lot about, something called the world spirit that's emerging into itself over the course of history, and whatever else this means, and how exactly it's supposed to relate to sort of, classical Christian ideas about God and, all that stuff. Certainly there's a story about spirit, or about, culture. Hegel definitely believes in stuff like national characters. In fact, that's kind of a important premise for him, that's like sort of playing out in a sort of autonomous way, right? It's not really being explained by a further factor outside of itself. And so if you think about the sort of transition from like ancient religions where the gods would have the heads of animals and stuff, to like Greek and Roman gods who are at least, fully anthropomorphized human beings, to the totally non-physical, God of the, Abrahamic religions, at least as far as God the Father goes, right? You get some sense of that increasing independence from nature, and this story is linked in some way to this notion of human powers, human freedom increasing. And
just to interject, I mean, Hegel is very expressive about that, right? Where he'll often characterize religion and mythology, right, as not necessarily irrational, right? And I want to point out that Marx, to a certain extent, picks up on this critique of religion. It's just that religion pictorially reflects the epoch in which spirit is at, right? So as you point out, when you're at a lower level of spirit, right, you tend to get these very kind of crude polytheistic religions that have to emphasize human beings' embeddedness within nature and subjectiveness to natural forces. Whereas when you get to Christianity, which you see as the kind of highest religious form, you get much more kind of abstract imagery and consequently much more abstract theology.
Which I should also say, if we're talking about the way these things are connected, anybody who's read as far as the end of the first chapter of Capital knows that in a certain sense, Marx in 1867 is still saying very similar things about religion. Marx is obviously, in a certain sense, a pretty militant atheist, but like he says, he says that like Protestant Christianity, he thinks it's the sort of highest incarnation of the religious impulse, because it's totally abstracted, away from all of that. Although Marx thinks that once you get to a classless society that no longer requires religious illusions, then you sort of don't even need that anymore. Which, by the way, for the record, I don't actually agree with. I wrote an essay for the Substack last year, called him a Marxist and an atheist, but I don't believe that religion would wither away under socialism. I think that
Probably not, no.
I think that given that death exists, I think that I think that religious ideas are always going to have emotional appeal. But in any case,
I do want to say you're absolutely right about his continued fixation on this, in my opinion, at least.
Yeah.
One of the most interesting kind of side notes that Marx makes about art and religion is actually in the first chapter of the Grundrisse, right, where he actually agrees with a Pascalian notion, right? So Pascal said one of the problems we're talking about the ancients is we think that they're very old. Actually, they were very young, right, in the sense that they're kind of working their way through certain very basic ideas about what it means to be human, and we've advanced on that because we're the ones who are genuinely old, right? And in the Grundrisse, Marx says, actually, this is one of the things that we can use to gain insight into why, say, the Homeric poems still give us delight, because he's kind of condescending here, a kind of childlike innocence to their mythology and these ideas that the Greeks had about primitive Greeks, right? Our relationship with nature, our relationship with one another, and our relationship with transcendent forces. But just like you can't go back to being a child again, we can never kind of reintegrate ourselves into that worldview because we moderns are just too sophisticated in terms of our mythologies and our religious imagery, right? And you might even be right about that, right? I mean, think about watching a movie like the Patriot, right, by Roland Emmerich in a postmodern era, right? Even something like that, we've become too cynical and self-reflective to really appreciate the kind of blunt patriotism that you see in something like this kind of material. And I think you can say something very similar, Karl Marx, about the Homeric poems, for example.
Yeah. Okay. So I think gets like a little bit of Marx, a little bit of Hegel there, but going more into Cohen's reading specifically of Marx. After this, you get to a chapter called The Constitution of the Productive Forces that I remember the first time I read this book. I can remember being a little bit confused about why we were going on and on and on about the productive forces because it's like, well, the fuck? I mean, when do we get to the class struggle, right? I mean, isn't that the, shouldn't that be the main event here? This all just kind of seems like scene setting. But then as you go on, you get what Cohen is doing, right? So he has this view that, and this is, I should say, he kind of gives you a very precise and rigorously worked out version of it, but in broad outlines, I mean, this is kind of all right there in Marx's 1859 preface, which is his most famous formulation of historical materialism, that you have that most of the errors of causation, and Cohen is very careful about this. He says, look, I'm not saying that like these are cases where the first thing causes things about the second thing, but the second thing doesn't cause anything about the first thing. That would clearly be silly, right? Like there are causal arrows going in various directions for all this stuff. But the main, the sort of the most important causal relations go from first the level of development of the forces of production to what the relations of production are, and then from the relations of production to the legal and political superstructure. So the level of development of the forces of production is like
I mean, I think he's very expressive about that when he's talking about functional explanation, right? If something has an effect, then you should probably try to explain the phenomena in terms of that effect. He has a wonderful kind of metaphor about why it is that burns have hollow bones, right? Where he says, example, right? And he says, well, they have hollow bones because that allows them to fly, right? And I think there's a certain degree of cogency to this argument that it's very rare in Marxist theory. And what's also nice about it, and I think this is one of the reasons why you're captivated in the same way I am, is it makes the stakes of what's involved very, very transparent. So agree or disagree, it's very clear about what it is that you are arguing about in terms of functional explanation in a way that you don't always get in Marxist theory when people are trying to describe the world.
Yeah, well, okay, so maybe let's skip to that point that you just made, right? Because this is, this is pretty significant because so far what we've been describing is, not uncontroversial, but only because nothing is, right? But like is all kind of stuff you can say, look, it's Marx says this right here, right? Like Cohen's kind of bringing it out, right? But I mean, it's all there in Marx. Is the so the view that you have, so level development of the forces of production, meaning like, do you have settled agriculture? Do you have plows? Do you have, factories, right? That's the level of development of the forces of production. That's, causally upstream of what the relations of production are. Do you have, slavery? Do you have lords and serfs? Do you have capitalists and workers? And, so like, I always think like early, like just on a very crude kind of view from 10,000 feet view, you might think, okay, like early hunter-gatherer societies, what Marx would call primitive communism, you don't have a ruling class because you kind of can't afford one, right? If there are people who aren't hunting and gathering, right, you're not going to have enough food to go around with the development of settled agriculture. Now you can afford one, but basically only if you make people work for you, at the, based on the, sharp end of a sword. And then with the level of, development of the forces of production with the Industrial Revolution, you get this new ruling class that's trying to accumulate profits through business activity, that what they, like the feudal ruling class needed a labor force that would basically just sit there and do what it was told and not leave. And now you have one that needs a labor force that is Marx says doubly free, right? It's both free, legally free to move around as you please and make employment contracts with any boss who will take you, and also free from any other means of supporting itself. And then with any luck, inshallah, right? You get the level of, capitalism develops the forces of production so much that it creates a possibility of a society that's communal in the way that those early hunter-gatherer societies were, but not communally, sharing scarcity, but based on abundance. So we could we could have egalitarianism plus abundance, more or less, right? So all that's in Marx. But I think what you're pointing to with that last thing you said, right, is like, okay, what's captivating about this, and I think it has to do with the contrast between the way Cohen is arguing about this stuff, and I think a lot of, and I think maybe, this is also going to get to the stuff that you find a little bit infuriating about it,
sure.
Which is sort of Cohen's views on methodology with the way that Marxist theory is so often done, right? That so we're kind of joking about earlier, right? Like Cohen, in his more polemical moments, would call analytical Marxism no bullshit Marxism, and in particular, the sort of the thing, like he has this wonderful story in the introduction to the second edition of the book, where he's talking about this early experience where, like in the early 1960s, he was presenting a paper called, he said, a not very analytical paper called Bourgeois and Proletarians at a reading group. And this American philosopher was interrogating him about exactly what he meant by some of the claims. And he was really frustrated because he thought it was hostile and, and unhelpful, though he said now I would consider it absolutely apt. And the guy kind of comes up to him afterwards, being like, look, I don't mind, I don't mind doing things a slightly different way. You just need to, tell me what the rules are, right? So I know how to evaluate this. And Cohen says the argument, hit deep, and he sort of strove afterwards to write less like a poet who sort of like doesn't really feel the need to justify his lines, right? It resonates or it doesn't, and to sort of provide kind of specific argument, like get very clear about disambiguating. Here are different possible things that this claim might mean. Here are the advantages and disadvantages of each. This is what I mean. What exactly is the evidence for it? And of course, at that level of description, this sounds like something that's like, look, these all sound like good things to do. Nobody would really fight you on that exactly, right? Like lots of people don't do it, right? But nobody would say, oh no, I hate clarity, right? So I think where it gets more controversial is that the thing that makes the kind of Marxism Cohen's trying to do, analytical Marxism analytic, is this belief that there's sort of no special Marxist way of figuring out what the truth is, right? That the rules are the same for everybody, that that Marxist theses have to be established on the basis of just sort of ordinary reasoning, like anybody like anybody would use, that there's no special Marxist kind of reasoning, which of course many people think that there is. Many people think that there's special dialectical reasoning, right? So he says at one point, I said that analytical Marxists do not think that Marxism possesses a distinctive and valuable method. Others believe that it has such a method, which they call dialectical. And I think some people who are reading this uncharitably sort of say, oh, I see. So Cohen doesn't like the dialectic stuff. I think what he says about this is a little bit subtler than that. He says, we believe that although the word dialectical has not always been used without a clear meaning, it has never been used with clear meaning to denote a method rival to the analytical one. And then he quotes at the bottom of that, he says, I do not think that the following, to take a recent example, describes such a method. And this is a quote from Etienne Balibar's The Philosophy of Marx. Says, this is precisely the first meaning we can give to the idea of a dialectic, a logic or a form of explanation specifically adapted to the determinate intervention of class struggle in the very fabric of history. And Cohen comments, if you read a sentence like that quickly, it can sound pretty good. The remedy is to read it more slowly. So I, we could talk about some of what I get out of that, but the reason I wanted to tee you up with this is because I think this kind of gets to, like, I think when I'd seen you post about this and I kind of pressed you on the infuriating half, I think you maybe sort of half jokingly, but also meaning it, right? Said, needs more Hegel.
I stand by that.
Yeah. So let's get into that.
Sure. Well, I just want to make clear what I find valuable in his approach before indicating what I think its limitations are. One, just from a kind of reader's perspective, I do think, again, the lucidity with which this point is expressed is extremely valuable and helpful, right? Because it does allow you to evaluate and think through its major claims without having to essentially try to figure out whether you're understanding those claims, right? Now, sometimes his arguments can be difficult to follow, but that's not because of the way they're expressed. It's just because the content is sometimes difficult, right? And that's an entirely different thing. And any reasonably good work of philosophy should get you to think a little bit about it, which this book clearly does, right? The second thing that I really like about this approach, which is more substantive, is while I have problems with what this denotes about Marxist approaches to history or to society, I do think that there's real value in recentering forces of production in our analysis in a way that Marxist theory sometimes can't ignore, particularly when it gets too continental, right? Because forces of production are really about the material ways in which we reproduce our social life in a very tangible way, right? Whether or not it's tilling the soil or, typing on a computer or laying brick, whatever it happens to be, right? And I want to point out how rare it is for any intellectual movement to really foreground that, which is something that Marx himself points out in relation to Hegel, right? One of the great intellectual vices that we usually fall into is assuming that society invariably reproduces itself through idealistic notions like culture or ideas, right? And that's a very easy thing for an intellectual to think, because that's what we're in the business of doing, thinking through ideas, right? But, if you strip away a lot of that, probably the case that things like roads and sewers and farms and refrigerators play a much bigger role in allowing us to reproduce our social life than, sadly, what you and I are doing here, for example.
Yeah. You couldn't have philosophy without agriculture. You could definitely have agriculture without philosophy.
Precisely, right. So I think that emphasis is extremely important, right? And it is something that Hegel genuinely does gesture to at various points, right? Like, Hegel was a great thinker, but it's not nearly as foregrounded as it is in Marxist analysis and in Cohen's interpretation of Marx. So very important stuff.
And I should say, I think that it's politically important, because if you think about certain kinds of intra-socialist debates, I think it does actually, like what it sort of brings our attention back to is that, like, one of the things that makes Marxism really different from earlier forms of socialist thought is that Marxism doesn't just see capitalism as this like avoidable moral mistake, right? Mm-hmm. Like I remember Walter Daum, don't remember the name of the book, but he has this like kind of funny line where he's sort of making fun of Maoists who think that, it doesn't matter what the level of development of the productive forces are in the society, and you still skip straight to socialism. And he says, if only God had given Adam and Eve little red books instead of apples in the Garden of Eden, they could have skipped all this, right? So it's like, so Marxism says this isn't like an avoidable moral mistake. This is a necessary stage in historical development, which is politically important, both when you think about stuff like, how should we think about, what went wrong with things like the Russian and Chinese revolutions, right? Those didn't lead to flourishing socialism. And in fact, is this something you should expect on the Marxist theory of history? Because it says that you need this high level of development of the forces of production to be possible to create a socialist society. Or even if you think about, current up to the moment kinds of debates about about ecology, right? Like you have this, you have two possible views on this, like, and one of which, and this is not an argument for it in itself, right? It's just like, Marxism could be wrong, right? But like, but it does. But I think it does sort of clarify what the, which combinations of positions make sense, which don't, right? Is it the case that what we need to sort of handle climate crisis, et cetera, is like a green technological revolution? Or is it the case that what we need is to consciously degrow the global productive forces, right? And I think that like classical historical materialism definitely comes down on one side of that argument.
Oh, without a doubt, right? And I'd like to just point out the broader kind of political observation that you're making, right? Terry Eagleton, in his book Materialism, kind of makes this very sweeping statement, which is that idealism has a propensity to lead people to conservatism. Now, I don't think that that's always true, right?
Sure.
But it is definitely true to a certain extent, right? There's a reason why, to go back to our old friend, Dr. Jordan Peterson, Peterson opened maps of meaning by saying, ideas and beliefs make the world in a more than metaphysical sense, whatever that means, right? Whereas Marx would say, no, actually, the world is what makes ideas, right?
Right.
Because when you foreground that, people's kind of tangible labor becomes a lot more important than what the ruling class thinks, and the kind of modes of ideological justification that it develops to vindicate its rule, right? Which forms so much of a part of our culture from a Marxist standpoint, right? So I think Eagleton is on the ball with something like that. I just want to kind of gesture to what I think some of the problems are with this kind of Cohen-esque analysis of the theory of history, because I do actually want to talk a little bit about his moral theory, since I addressed that at greater length.
So I definitely want to do that, right? But like just because I think the sort of flow of this would make the most sense in this order. Of course. Before we get to the other of the two big things I wanted to hear about from you, right? Because I know you have thoughts about it, which is how this sort of historic Cohen style historical materialism fits with some of Cohen's normative views.
Of course, yeah.
Before we do that, I just want to at least get a sense of the first part, right? Which is the sort of not enough Hegel part. That like so I think that could play out on two levels. You know, one of which is that sort of like, you know, specific concepts that you think are lacking, that, you know, that maybe should be there. Like, you know, you'd mentioned this idea of the totality to me when we were talking about this before the episode. And then the other is maybe on a more general methodological level, right? You know, that is there something about, you know, like in other words, maybe you could, for example, maybe you disagree with the claim that like there isn't like a dialectical method that adds up to its own method of like figuring out what's true about the world, right? Maybe you think it does, or, you know, so I just kind of wanted to give you a chance to situate yourself a little bit in those debates.
Sure, absolutely, right. So there are two things that I think I can say about this, and we'll just start with that, right?
Sure.
The first is that I do think that there is a dialectical method to Marx. I think David Harvey actually expresses this very nicely in his book on nature.
Sorry, which one?
His book on Marx's process theory, right?
Yep.
Anyway, I don't want to kind of delve into too much about Harvey-esque kind of takes, but one of the things that he points out is that the dialectical method eschews arguments about unidirectional causality, right? In the sense that we say A causes B, causes C, causes D, right? Now, I don't think that Cohen makes that kind of argument about Marx's theory of history, but there is a kind of unicausal structure that is often baked into the book from my perspective, right? This idea that fundamentally forces of production are what determine relations of production, which in turn, as you put it, determines the superstructure. And yes, there might be kind of a recursion of causality back into the forces of production from the relations of production and the superstructure. But really, we have to accord primacy to the relations of production. And Harvey is going to say, no, actually, the way to understand Marxism is as a kind of multi-causal recursive understanding of how social phenomena emerge, right? Where everything kind of bleeds into one another and then bleeds back into what influenced it in the first place, right? And his metaphor for this is it's better to understand Marx as thinking about how to explain society in terms of concentric circles rather than a kind of linear set of relations. And I, broadly speaking, tend to think that that's correct, right? If you want, and this actually does have pretty serious implications, right? Marxists kind of tear themselves up into trying to say things like, well, let's use an example that's often broad. Do the forces of production at a given time determine the ideological content that emerges in a society, say like Protestantism? Because it seems like you have to be committed to that thesis. You can't be committed to the idea that Protestantism could have an independently important impact in determining how the forces of production develop at any given time.
Just the briefest footnote here, right? So I think that the classical picture is going to be that the forces of production ultimately determine, like what the relations of production are, and then the relations of production, they're going to determine, superstructural things like, for the sake of argument, right? Whether you have the Protestant Reformation.
Yeah, that's exactly it, right? I mean, from this kind of unicausal perspective, you'll say things like, look, we entered into a capitalist mode of production where the forces of production started to assume these capitalistic features. Consequently, there were changes in the relations of production as we transitioned from feudalism towards, say, liberal democracy. And consequently, at the ideological level of the superstructure, you see Protestantism emerge as the appropriate kind of religion for this time period. I don't think that that's really accurate, right? I tend to agree with certain Weberian sociologists that Protestantism, at the very least, had an important role to play in engendering ideological and indeed phenomenological support for the way that capitalism organizes itself at the level of forces of production. And I don't think that this is an exact science. And if you press me on it, I won't be able to exactly explain what that relationship is. But I think it's convincing to make that kind of argument. And Harvey's understanding of this of the dialectical method as multi-causal and recursive seems to account for me, seems to account for these kinds of processes better than Cohen's does, right? And then the second point that I want to make about totality is related to this, right? So if you adopt a kind of functionalist understanding of how society operates, wherein, forces of production determine, or at least given primacy over relations of production, which are giving primacy over the superstructure, right? You're tending to understand things in terms of unicausal explanations. Whereas once you understand things in this more dynamic way, you understand that you need to appreciate society as a totality, right? Where rather than having one thing cause another, everything, to use my earlier metaphor, bleeds into one another in certain important kinds of ways. And I would actually argue that in later editions of Karl Marx's theory of history, Cohen did seem to be moving in this direction, at least to a certain extent. He makes this distinction in the latter chapters of the book, the 2000 edition, between inclusive and exclusive historical materialism, right? Where he says, inclusive historical materialism tends to assume that you can explain an enormous array of phenomena by talking about forces of production, right? Let's go with the example, right? You can explain the emergence of Protestantism by talking about, the introduction of, the spinning jenny, for example. And he says, that does seem pretty problematic, right? Anybody who's committed to that is going to run into a serious amount of trouble. So he says, instead, we should adopt a more exclusive understanding of historical materialism that just tries to account for the emergence of economic phenomena through this kind of functionalist set of explanations and unique causality. Now, that is more palatable to me. I just tend to think, again, that Harvey's explanation of what Marx's method is allows us to have a richer understanding of the relations between these different social phenomena without giving up a lot of the ambitions of classical Marxism in a way that committing ourselves to exclusive historical materialism would require, right? Even if it's more analytically palatable from a Cohenian perspective. So I think those are my two core criticisms of this book. Now, saying that, right, I point out in my paper that I think there are probably ways of rescuing some of the limitations of this theory from the straitjacket into which I've just pushed it, particularly by looking at Cohen's work on commodity fetishism, where I do think he's a lot more attentive to the way the phenomenological outlook that capitalism induces recurses back into the way that people relate to things like commodities, which in turn, of course, recurses back into the kind of things that people produce. But this isn't a really fully developed idea yet. So if you press me on it too much, I wouldn't be able to give you a very substantive answer about how to kind of engage in this rescuing process, because I just don't know at this point.
Okay, yeah, that's chapter 5 of the Cohen is on fetishism. Yeah, that was interesting. That was helpful. So I mean, my concern is, and this, if there was a, this might have happened early enough in the evening that, that everybody was still pretty sober, and when I start to say it, it'll come back, but, that, like, I remember one of the things I said at the Hegel reading group was that, I think that it's important to try to translate claims made in Hegelese to ordinary languages about cause and effect and mechanisms, right? So, and I think that this kind of gets back to that quote we looked at earlier from Cohen, where he says, "Look, it's not that I don't think that words like dialectical have ever been used to express anything, true, right? Like it's just like that." Or that they've never been used in a clear way. It's just I don't think they've been used in a clear way to sort of signify this distinctive methodology. And so, my view on this would be: look, when you look at a sort of key dialectical word like contradiction, that's something that can mean a few different things. I actually think in various places Marx uses it to mean a few different things. And, talk about like contradictions in a system in the sense of it having, system having different conditions for realization that are undermining each other. For example, talk about, sometimes even just means like kind of like a social antagonism, right? Contradiction between classes, and we could go on, right? With a few of these, but
I do just want to say I do think that Harvey does successfully achieve the kind of goal that you set out for accounting for historical dialectics, right, or materialist dialectics. Excuse me, right? Sometimes he's extremely lucid about this, right? One example that I draw from his book, as he points out that Marx tends to talk a lot more about processes rather than things, which is, again, where this idea of concentric circles rather than linear relations comes to mind. And this can seem extremely obscure, but he points out that actually a lot of us kind of have an instinctive understanding of how to approach subject matters dialectically. Say you get into an argument with your girlfriend or wife, right? A lot of the times, if you go back and you try to analyze that argument and you say, well, what started it? You'll realize that nobody really started it unless you set out to have an argument. It's not clear where it really began, right? You said something, then she said something, and then you responded to what she was saying. And not only did you respond to what she was saying, you were also trying to think about how she was going to respond to what you're saying, right? So there's kind of multi-causal, overlapping, recursive processes that emerge that ultimately lead to catastrophe or resolution, depending on how the fight goes, right? And Harvey points out that Marx is applying obviously a much more complicated way of thinking about processes to an understanding of society as multi-causal and recursive. And this is why I think his account of Marxist dialectics allows us to keep a lot of the classical ambitions of Marxist social theory while being able to express its key points in a language that's quite lucid, certainly compared to what you find in a lot of competitors, right? Which is not to discount Cohen's contribution.
So yeah, I mean, I have to say, I have been reading a lot of Harvey lately because I've been teaching a class about capital, and so I keep referring back to Harvey's Companion, which I like, right? I want to be clear on this. It's a good book. I don't want to discourage anybody from reading it, right? But I do often find myself a little bit frustrated with the way he approaches the dialectics talk in that book, and I think that part of the, I guess maybe one pithy way of gesturing at my concern here is that if you say, okay, we have some claim that's made in, that's sort of originally formulated in dialectic speak, that it's like, look, that doesn't, could be right, but then what we need to do to be, before we can even figure out that it's right, is we need to translate it into some sort of ordinary claims about causes and effects and mechanisms that we can then test against the evidence. And one way of getting at the concern is just to say, look, it can be a little bit of a cheat code, right? To be like, oh, does A cause B or does B cause A? Oh, man, it's dialectical. Right?
I do remember actually, apparently Marx was asked once about a particularly difficult passage. And he said, look, whenever I didn't quite understand the relationship between two things yet, I just threw the word dialectical at it and let it be, right? A professor of mine once said that. And without a doubt, that's true, right? And this is where I don't want to sacrifice the level of lucidity that Cohen brings to Marxist theory, because I think it has been extremely important, right? However, right, I think that Harvey makes a pretty compelling case that if you move away from the contribution to a critique of political economy to the structure of Das Kapital itself, it does have this kind of process-oriented social ontology in mind, where if you look at capital, right, he starts off with an analysis of the commodity, which seems like a pretty minuscule thing. Like you said, you'd think, well, wouldn't you start off with an analysis of class theory, right? Or an analysis of the state, or analysis even of life in the factory, right? And Harvey says, the reason why he's starting off with the commodity is the commodity crystallizes a lot of the different social relations that are important to capital. And then again, by starting with an analysis of it, we can then move outward in the circle to understanding the different social relations that surround this in a way that is illuminating, right? But it's not like, as he points out, there's just one starting point where you could have begun capital. He could have just as easily begun from another point and then moved in a different direction, which he does, as Harvey points out, in things like Volume 2 and in things like Volume 3. The metaphor he uses is that any entry point into capital is kind of like trying to enter into a house from a different window, right? Yeah, you could have chosen another kind of window. Trying to enter a house from a different kind of door. Excuse me, I think is the metaphor he uses, right? Yes, you could have chosen to go through another door, and that might have been illuminating, right? But what's important isn't necessarily the entry point so much as gaining a better understanding of the house as a totality. And I think that's what capital is ultimately trying to do, right? Enter into an analysis of the mode of production that is capitalism from many different entry points, but ultimately expressing it as a kind of whole.
Yeah, I mean, my own take on why Marx starts Capital by talking about commodities is that, and I mean, look, that choice could definitely be questioned on a sort of literary style level. It's you know, he does not start out with the most riveting part of the book, but like analytically, that it's that, you know, a lot of Marx's argument in Capital is that you know, capitalism, you know, as a, you know, class society is something that falls out of some very basic facts about how markets work, combined with a distribution of property, you know, that gets you a class of owners to class of propertyless laborers, and you know, and so I think something Marx does a lot actually in Capital is he wants to look at a certain aspect of capitalism, so he sort of brackets away everything else, right? So like he does a lot of things in Capital where he's like, look, I'm just going to pretend that you know, labor power is always purchased at its value. Nobody's ever paid less than the historically determined standard of subsistence. He obviously knows that that's not true. There's all sorts of things elsewhere in the book about why that's not true, but he's just going to assume it, sort of for the same reason why like a word problem in a physics, you know, test might like make a lot of weird simplifying assumptions that, you know, we know aren't actually true, because you know, you want to just isolate the one thing you want to look at. So I think he starts out by talking about commodities because look, whatever else is true of capitalism is a system that's based on commodity production. And so let's think about how markets in general work before we get to capitalist labor markets. But I guess, okay, so you did as part of your case for I don't know, dialectics, more Hegel, David Harveyism, you know, all that stuff. You mentioned this business about what the explanatory scope of historical materialism is, right? What is this supposed to be a theory of, right? Because I do think this is something that like anybody who wants to be serious about this is going to have to like think about, because if Marxism is supposed to be a theory, like historical materialism is supposed to be a theory of like why everything that's ever happened has ever happened, it's probably wrong. Because
Definitely.
You know,
somebody was joking about this in the chats, right? If, to use my early example, you think you can explain your argument with your girlfriend through historical materialism, then you're probably out to lunch, right? Although, if you want to make the effort, I'd love to see what happens.
I mean, you know, maybe in the McManus Trejo household, but that's more of a function of the interests of the two people in that relationship. But yeah, I think if you're gonna say like, yeah, if you want to explain why everything that's ever happened, I mean, like there probably just isn't going to be a good theory of everything that's ever happened, because human behavior is really complicated and multi-causal. And like, it's, you know, if your explanatory ambitions are, you know, I want to know, why World War I started when it did, and I want to know why the plot of the last Marvel movie was what it was, and I want to know why I had that fight with my girlfriend or whatever. Then it's like, yeah, that's probably more than a theory of history can plausibly tell you. What it can plausibly tell you is an interesting issue, though, and I think that can transition us into the last big thing I wanted to talk to you about.
Well, if I could just interject, right? So, in terms of the kind of explanatory value that's offered by a more dialectical approach to understanding Marxism, I think that one of the kind of cash values of this, that was a big fuck up on my part. I mean, you can climb in through windows also, but anyway, it's
no, it made sense to me when you said it. I accepted it, but
yeah, no. Anyway, well, you see out of windows, you look into windows, but long story short, right? I think that what Harvey and dialectical analysis offer us is a way of understanding how the unique phenomenology that capitalism induces, the kind of way that people look at the world, is extremely important in trying to understand why the forces of production remain what they are, right? And again, this can't be understood just in terms of the forces of production inducing us to think in a certain kind of way, because the way that we think about our relationship to nature is independently important, right? And I think that Marx is very clear about this, particularly in the Grundrisse, but also in Capital, right, where he entitles his books Critiques of Political Economy. Now, critique has a very specific meaning in the German idealist tradition, right? It's not criticism in the sense of saying this is wrong, right? In a Kantian sense, it's explaining what are the preconditions for the emergence of this mode of thinking, and what are its generative possibilities and limitations, right? And what Marx adds to this, of course, is an account of how history and material forces also contribute to establishing productive limitations and generative possibilities for our ways of thinking about things. And the reason that this is important, I think, comes very clear in the chapter on commodity fetishism, right? Where Marx points out a kind of crude materialism would just look at a person who wants to buy a Gucci bag and say, how ridiculous, right? You think that purchasing that Gucci bag is going to make you special in some kind of way? It's just a bit of cloth that was probably made by sweatshop kids somewhere in Indonesia. Stop it, right? But Marx will say, no, actually, the weird thing about it is if you have a Gucci bag, people will treat you differently, right? Because in our given society, which is ruled by abstractions, right? People will ascribe a kind of social status to you by possession of that, because you possess that bag, that they wouldn't if you didn't. So the person isn't acting irrationally to want to buy that bag if they want to gain the social status that would accrue from this. The mistake that is made here is assuming that there is something necessary about the social status that accrues to the Gucci bag. There's nothing necessary that accrues to it. It is purely a contingent feature of the kind of social powers that we embed in the Gucci bag, given the historical moment that we live in right now. And once one realizes that, you might be less compelled to think that we need to live under that mode of production. Maybe we could transition to another one when we aren't ruled by all these kinds of abstractions. And this, of course, is important in understanding why it is that people consume the kind of commodities that they do, because they have a kind of fetishistic attraction to them. And it's very important in understanding Marx from a kind of phenomenological perspective. And in turn, once we realize that, we can understand why we would devote so much energy through the force of production to producing things like Gucci bags rather than producing things like sufficient food for everybody to live off of, because we're ruled by these abstractions, and there's a lot of profit to be made by catering to them, right? So this is why I think it's important not to abandon the more expansive ambitions of Marxism, because I think that Marxism, is trying to describe the social totality, needs to take into account these kinds of phenomenological forces, in addition to things like the forces of production. And I'm not sure that Cohen's theory, as it stands in the book, is capable of doing that, even though, and I want to re-emphasize this, I think that there are a lot of intimations in the book that you could build upon to try to integrate these different concerns in a way that'd be theoretically satisfying.
Yeah. So I was just pointing out chapter 4 of Cohen's The Material and Social Properties of Society, I think is the most relevant to some of what you're talking about there. But yeah, look, I think that, I do have a take on this, but what I want to, because I don't want this to get lost, right? Because I think this is, so I will, come back and do my take on what you just said if we have time. But because I think it's going to come back up anyway. So the other thing that I know you have thoughts about it takes us right back to where we started at the beginning of the Cohen conversation, which is, okay, so Cohen makes big contributions to, Marxist theory in two different areas, right? One is like really, Marxism properly speaking, right? Like historical materialism.
Sure.
And the other is normative arguments for socialism. And I know, I think you say something like this, in fact, in the essay that you're writing for our collection. I know you have concerns about how the two overlap, or intersect with each other, right? In particular, because, Cohen, like part of Cohen's critique of somebody like Rawls is that, and I know just out of frame, there's probably like a giant Rawls statue somewhere behind you.
He looks down on me, right? Not judgmentally because he's Rawls, but definitely, hoping that I'll carry forward his legacy in a way that's
yeah. So like part of Cohen's critique of Rawls is that Rawls has this view that the difference principle that if we're sort of trying to figure out what justice demands, we factor in these empirical things about society that we're living in, and that actually sort of becomes part of like the algorithm, the moral algorithm that we use to like figure out what would count as like an unjust level of inequality, for example, right? Is would it destroy incentives that people need to maintain a certain level of productivity that ultimately ends up benefiting everybody and is redistributed through the welfare state or blah blah blah, right? Like that's Rawls. And Cohen has this critique of that that's subtle, because I think people oftentimes get this slightly wrong, and they think, Rawls sort of concedes that you need to make a certain amount of sacrifice of perfect equality for the sake of economic efficiency, and like Cohen doesn't. And it's like, no, Cohen does actually concede that. He just thinks about what we're doing with that trade-off very differently than Rawls does, right? So Cohen would say, no, the empirical facts about like what incentives do we need to maintain this level of efficiency isn't part of the moral algorithm for deciding what justice is. It's just that once we decide what justice demands, we can trade off justice against other values, and that's where like economic efficiency, for example, gets its vote, right? That it's like, we have this pragmatic consideration about actually we might end up lowering the standard of living for everybody if we don't have enough incentives or whatever. We can take that in mind, but we still have this more demandingly egalitarian notion of justice that's our normative North Star. So Cohen's picture of this is his view about justice is transhistorical, that there's the standard that doesn't depend on the kind of empirical facts about the part of history that you're in at any given time. Although when we're applying it, of course, then we can take all that stuff into consideration. And all of this is just kind of set up to say, I think that you have a concern about how this intersects with historical materialism, because tell me if I'm getting this wrong, but we've talked to sure. So one layer of classical historical materialism as defended by Cohen and Karl Marx's theory of history is level development of the forces gives you the relation. But then the other layer is relations give you the superstructure. And I think thinking about that second point makes you think that there's some tension between that and this kind of transhistorical notion of justice.
Well, this is a very technical point, but it's an important one, so I'm going to dwell a little bit on it, right? The first, I'm going to start with Rawls, and then I'll move to Cohen, because that's the way it proceeds in the essay, and I think it makes more sense, right?
Yeah.
It's also where I can take make a gentle critique of the left of Phil people. So, Left of Phil did an essay, did a episode not too long ago on Robert Nozick, which is great. I strongly encourage everyone to listen to it, right? They offer some fantastic critiques of Nozick. But they have an aside on Rawls where they basically accept Nozick's critique of Rawls as essentially starting from the classical liberal standpoint of the individual. And in Rawls's case, he reaches this conclusion for redistribution that the left of Phil people and Nozick don't think you can reach if you actually start from the methodological starting point of classical liberalism, focusing on the individual and their rights. Now, they would be right if Rawls did start from the methodological standpoint of classical liberalism, the individual and his or her rights. But he doesn't start from there, right? He's actually very express in his lectures on the history of moral philosophy that the basic structure is the core subject of justice. And he says this is an idea that he took directly from Hegel. Now, the reason why the basic structure is the first subject of justice is because Rawls is very insistent that we need to be fact sensitive in trying to develop our principles of justice, and that means acknowledging the sociality of human beings the whole way down, and our fundamental interdependence and the particular form that these relations of interdependence assume, right? It's extremely important. And this is where this argument for the difference principle comes in part, right? Where he says, given contemporary conditions of relative scarcity and the fact that we can assume that human beings for the foreseeable future, at least, are not going to become benevolent angels, right? We should implement the difference principle so that any inequalities that exist will work to the benefit of the least well off, even if people are not inclined to be self-sacrificing and work to the benefit of the least well off directly. Right now, there are a lot of different criticisms you can make of this position, and I do make certain kind of criticisms of this position. But I do think that that is closer in spirit to Marx's argument about the need to have a fact-sensitive approach to normativity, ironically, than the late Cohen's work is. Right? I'm not talking about Karl Marx's theory of history. I'm talking about Rescuing Justice and Equality, his last book, his major criticism of Rawls. Now, it's a brilliant book, right? I want to be very clear about that. He launches some very sustained, very deep, and very rich critiques of Rawls's entire outlook that are well worth going through. But one of the remarkable things about the book is the second half, where he says, I think that justice should actually be fact insensitive, right? In fact, he even appeals to Plato and says, principles of justice should be transhistorical in a certain kind of way. Now, whatever you think about that position, and I'm very skeptical of it, it's very much not a kind of Marxist position, since Marx followed, like Rawls, tended to emphasize, look, right can only be as high as the mode of production at any given time in history. That's a quote from the Critique of the Gotha program, right? So this idea of a kind of transhistorical Platonic theory of justice or principles of justice has this kind of anti-Marxist quality to it that I don't think you could lodge against Rawls's theory, at least with the same kind of force. Now, you could follow Cohen and just saying, well, then so much the worse for Marx, right? We should have a transhistorical Platonic account of principles of justice. And I think he defends that quite adequately in the second half of the book. But I do think that we lose something serious with that because I want my normativity to be fact sensitive since I believe in Marx and Rawls. But secondly, I also think it creates serious problems for how to reconcile his normative views with the theory of history that he laid out in Karl Marx's theory of history. And it's unclear to me what the relationship between his later period and his early period is, given this new commitment to a kind of fact-insensitive normativity. And I wouldn't be so worried about this if at any point he kind of enacted a clean break, right? Just said, look, that book is who I was in 1979, right? This is me now in the 2000s, and I just don't believe what I did anymore.
But he actually puts out an edition in 2000 where he doesn't say any of that, right? So
no, he doesn't. He says, there are problems with this, but I'm still reasonably convinced by the argument that I put forward here. So it seems like, on the one hand, he wants to still defend at least a version of Karl Marx's theory of history, while at the same time embracing a normative account of normativity that's facts insensitive and transhistorical, that's entirely antithetical to the spirit of Karl Marx's theory of history and his account of where normativity comes from. Now, I'm not going to knock Cohen too hard for this, because I think that these are enormous problems for anybody who wants to be a Marxist or also be committed to justice. And I'm not sure that anybody has actually been able to resolve this problem in a completely satisfactory way. Cohen probably gets closer than most, right? But it is a problem. We can't just ignore it. And I think it needs to be thought through with enormous care.
Yeah. Okay. So that's good. So that last part is where, kind of what I was trying to tee up, because I remember you saying that last part in the essay that you're writing for our collection.
Yeah.
And
actually, I want to say, I think that's the part of the essay that's probably best. Some of the essay, I think there are parts that I think are less significant, but that's the one that I thought was a good contribution.
Okay. So, and I want to start out by just saying, I actually find a fair amount to agree with in the first part of what you just said, right?
Sure.
Like I actually do think that there's something that's like very much in the spirit of like Marx and socialism in Rawls's basic structure constraint, right? That justice is about the structure of society, in a way that's not about individual behavior. And in fact, I think in Cohen's Gifford lectures, which are collected as this book called "If You're an Egalitarian, How Come You're So Rich?" which I was, when I was carrying that around, I was reading it. I always told people that the title was aspirational for me. I want to get to the point where people, that's a good way to own me, right? Is to ask if I'm an egalitarian, why am I so rich? But in any case, in that book, he even kind of says at one point, it's like, look, Cohen grew up in a, Communist Party of Canada and fellow travelers family in Montreal. And he's like, look, my relatives in Montreal would totally be on Rawls's side of this. Right? And I think they would. And I also think that, the comrades in Montreal were largely correct about that. Right. Like, I think that it is actually important to, I think, much bigger take, but I think like social justice and individual moral virtue are both important things, but they're two very different things, right? So, in any case, so that part I'm largely sympathetic with. But the question about like the transhistorical standard of justice and how it fits in with historical materialism, as Cohen defends it, and Karl Marx's theory of history. I guess I do have a defense to run of that, and I want to see if I can do that very quickly, right? Which is first of all, on the sort of technical point, like if there's going to be a conflict between these two things, it's going to be at the level of the second part of the theory of history, the superstructures caused by the relations of production. Because you might think, well, okay, so if values are superstructural in some way, right? Then that is then there could be some sort of problem there. I would note that if you read that chapter of Cohen, so that's sorry, Andy made all these neat graphics. That's chapter 8.
These are cool, yeah.
Based in superstructure, power, and rights. Then what he, then he actually is pretty careful on this issue there. What he says is that there are two ways of understanding the base superstructure claim that are sort of present in a lot of Marxist thought. One of them is the superstructure just means like all non-economic institutions. And the other one is the superstructure means those non-economic institutions whose characters explained by the nature of the economic structure. This, in a way, takes us back to what you were saying earlier about some of the distinctions he's making in the second edition about
like inclusive and exclusive historical materialism.
Yeah, inclusive and restricted, I think. But
restricted. Yeah, excuse me.
Yeah. And I think that he. Like one of the points he makes is that in fact Marx doesn't talk about like an ideological superstructure, I mean, that's like much later Marxist thought, right? When Marx talks about superstructure, you know, he uses the phrase legal and political superstructure. Now, to be fair, I think Marx does actually also say some things that, even if he doesn't put words together in that way, strongly suggest the idea that a lot of ideology is superstructural, you know, sometimes in the same passages, you know, talking about social being and social consciousness and all that stuff. But
particularly in the ideology, right, where it talks about how it's not the case, right, that men's consciousness produces their being, right? It's men's being that produces their consciousness, right? Interpreted in a kind of materialist way, you'd think, well, okay, well, then again, the linear relation must be that the forces of production, which are more material than what we find in the superstructure, is what determines the relations of production, which is what determines our ways of apprehending the world, including morality, at a superstructural level.
Yeah. So, and this is again where I would say, I mean, look, I'll go back to even what I told Charlie Kirk, which is I think that, you know, I think the Marxist theory of history is basically right, but you got to take the stuff a la carte a little bit, right? Which is to say that, look, if you go with interpretation number one, right, superstructure is all non-economic institutions, then the claim that the superstructure is downstream of the relations of production just gets a lot less plausible, because certainly economic forces are a big part of the cause of, you know, various ideological, cultural things that, you know, happen in a given society. But I think it just gets a little silly and implausible if you say it's like the cause, you know, like that's the only thing that causes any of that. Again, I think real history is pretty multi-causal, and you know, I'm not even sure that just saying, oh, we're not going to worry about where most of the arrows go because it's dialectical, man, is going to help that much here, right? Because it's not just that, like, what's the causal relationship between these two things. It's that if you want to explain why all the non-economic stuff is the way that is, yeah, the economic stuff's going to be part of it, but a whole bunch of other factors are going to are probably going to come in also. So I would just really briefly say on this, and then I want to kind of go to your core point, right, about the trans-historical standard of justice, that you know, so there's a really useful distinction in a kind of I don't know, you know, like a you know, important bit of Karl Marx's theory of history fan fiction, Reconstructing Marxism, by Andrew Levine and Elliot Sober and Eric Olin Wright, is, you know, which is just a flippant way of saying like a book that sort of that picks up a lot of the debates that were started by that. They make this distinction at the end that I didn't love when I first read it, but I've kind of warmed up to it over time, right? Between saying there's sort of three ways that you can be a Marxist about things, where they talk about orthodox Marxism, neo-Marxism, and post-Marxism. So where, you know, orthodox Marxist class analysis, so, you know, says that things that, you know, that class analysis is going to be like the most important part of the explanation of something. Neo-Marxist is going to say, well, it's going to be very important. And post-Marxist sort of says, you know, it's a thing, right? It's a thing we're interested in, right? And I say, like, just kind of roughly using that, I'd say, look, I think if you're interested in, like, I think the thing that, like, the case for orthodox Marxism is strongest for is the, like, really big picture view from 10,000 feet questions about, like, why is it that we used to have feudalism and now capitalism is everywhere, right? Sure. Why is it that now in the 21st century, where capitalism is everywhere, we have this certain set of characteristic legal institutions, for example, that are based on, you know, sort of nominal universal equality, and why is it that under feudalism it was so different? Things like that. I think that when you start to go into those broader explanatory ambitions, I don't just want to understand how modes of production rise and fall over the course of time and how that leads to certain sort of big structural changes in the legal and political institutions, but I also want to ask like all these like questions about ideology and culture and all this stuff. I think at that point, probably plausibility considerations would nudge me towards something more like neo-Marxism. That's like, well, this is a pretty big factor that's going to be important. There's no guarantee that it's going to be the most important thing, right?
Sure. I mean, if I could just interject, I'd say that in my interpretation of historical materialism, of my commitment to it, there are kind of two core things that I think are valuable in it, right? The first, as I mentioned before, that Cohen does foreground, is this stringent emphasis on the fact that we are material beings and we are required to labor materially in order to reproduce our social and our biological life, which is something that is enormously obscured by contemporary bourgeois ideology and a variety of other factors, right? And I think that is politically important in the way that you and I talked about before, right? By emphasizing the materiality of our social and biological life, we draw attention to who builds the bridges, who builds the buildings, who makes the computers and the clothes, right? That's extremely important. But the other thing that I think is extremely important about Marxism that is, to a certain sense, inclusive in a way that Cohen sometimes seems to push against, though not on the reading that you just gave, is this idea that the modes of cognition which are induced by the conditions in which we live are independently important and trying to understand why we interact with one another the way that we do, and indeed how we organize our relationship to the forces of production, right? And I think that Cohen's system is capable of incorporating this concern, particularly in the chapters that I mentioned on fetishism and power, right? I just don't know that it's done in as clean and as systematic a way as I would like. But I think it's extremely important if we're going to pay homage to this core Marxist insight, which is that a critique of political economy means understanding the generative possibilities and limitations that are imposed upon human life by the ways that we apprehend the world under capitalism, or indeed under any mode of production, where we aren't able to perceive things the way that they actually are.
Yeah, right. I think that mostly sounds right to me. I guess the last thing I wanted to say is, just because I kind of feel like I have to say it as the late Michael Brooks would say, it's sort of a core brand proposition, right? You know, if there's, you know, one of the things that I've tried very hard to do in the last, you know, I don't know, 5 years, 6 years, however long I've been doing this, is to you know, teach leftists to take the fact value distinction seriously. So like, I think that the, you know, historical materialism, you know, is a set of causal explanatory claims about historical facts.
Sure.
But then when you start thinking about the relationship between that and you know, moral values, justice, you know, all of that stuff, right? Then, you know, we need to tread carefully, because by itself, nothing in the first bucket can actually entail anything one way or the other about the second one, right? I mean, this is Hume's law, right? You can't logically derive an ought from an unassisted is. And, you know, in particular, when you think about that line that you quoted from the Critique of the Gotha Program, right, that right can't rise higher than the material foundation. You know, there are two different ways of understanding that, and actually, Cohen has an essay. I think this is in Finding Oneself in the Other, but anyway, it's his essay about Isaiah Berlin, and Isaiah Berlin's like view about Marx, which is actually like a whole fascinating thing in itself. That it's like the sort of weird buddy cop intellectual friendship between those two guys. But he, in that essay, Cohen makes this comment where he, you know, I think showing that he's very aware of the kind of critique that you're pressing here, right? Where he says, yeah, people think that this means that, you know, Marx doesn't think there's such a thing as trans-historical justice. But he thinks, look, you know, if we're sort of saying right can only rise as high as the material foundation of society, I mean, we've got
Well, okay,
if we're talking about higher and lower, right, there's got to be some kind of scale that we're using to measure them, right? Like that actually in itself sounds transhistorical. That like there's got to be some way that we can say it's not just like sort of right for this stage of history, right for that one, but that we can say, oh, the level of right that's achieved at this stage of history is higher than the one at that one, right? So we've got to have some sense, some transhistorical sense of directionality, at least, like what counts as higher and lower. And so I've got to say, maybe this is just some like wretched unmaterialist Platonism deep in my soul that I need to purge. But I think that there's something that's very appealing to me about the idea that, you know, we can sort of say, look, it might be a moral tragedy at any given stage of history that we just have to swallow a certain amount of injustice because like we don't know how to, like we're just not in a position to achieve something more just, you know, without, you know, unacceptable sacrifices in other areas, you know, like efficiency. But like, I don't know, we should have some sense of what it is that we're trading away when we make those trade-offs, right? You know, so we should still, you know, we should still accept it. And like, this is why, despite agreeing with you and Rawls about some of the basic structure stuff and all of that, right, there still seems to be something very right to me about the idea that it's like, yeah, look, we might have good reasons to accept, you know, like a certain amount of inequality at a given stage of history, given what we can accomplish, et cetera. Maybe like, you know, look, maybe the best we can accomplish right now, 5 minutes after capitalism, is some sort of market socialism that'll still have, you know, that, you know, will eliminate a lot of the inequalities of capitalism, but it's still going to have some, you know, it'll still have some that it might be difficult to normatively justify just because like we don't know how to fix those yet. But like, it still seems important to recognize that something is lost when we made that trade-off.
Sure. I mean, I do think that there's something that's seriously lost, right? By trying to overly historicize and overly naturalize morality. I just push against a kind of excess Platonism in our moral outlook. So I'll just kind of begin at the kind of outset of this. I think that it's absolutely true that Marx does have a transhistorical understanding of what morality is. Now you have to reconstruct it carefully, and he's often resistant to that reading of his work, but precisely for the reasons that you articulated, I think it's unavoidable that one would reach that conclusion, precisely because there's really no way of evaluating whether we've reached a higher epoch of society, and right has consequently reached a higher level than some kind of independent set of normative criteria for evaluating what that would even mean. And I tend to agree with Rodney Peffer's take on Marx, which is to read him as ultimately a mixed deontologist, in the sense that he felt, in a kind of Hegelian, Aristotelian way, that creating the material conditions for the maximization of human freedom, understood socially, of course, should be the end of a human society. But this needs to be understood in terms of the development of human powers rather than a kind of transcendental way, right? In order to be truly free, we need to establish the right kind of material conditions for us to develop our capabilities in conjunction with others. And this will allow a richer flourishing of human life, right? And I think that's without a doubt a kind of transhistorical commitment that you find baked in to all of Marx's overarching project, right? Now, saying that, right, the reason why I have a certain degree of reticence about embracing Cohen's overall normative project at its conclusion, right, in Rescuing Justice Equality, is I do think that to a certain extent, when we are adjudicating moral claims, we want to be sensitive to social, biological, and psychological facts about individuals. Projecting this kind of utopian idea of what we should do, that's entirely insensitive to this. Just seems to me to be giving into a kind of utopian impulse of the sort that my own materialism leads me to be at least slightly allergic to, even if there's an enormous appeal to it, right? Now, in terms of the kind of trade-offs that we see involved here, I think the example that you gave is a very good one, you know, market socialism, right? So in his last book, Why Not Socialism, right, Cohen points out, look, many people who argue for a kind of market socialism, and I include Rawls in that, claim that this would enable us to achieve a high degree of reciprocity in society, and it would allow people to contribute to the social well-being and establish a society where the free development of each was a condition for the free development of all, without relying upon these transformative visions of human nature, where we would become hyper altruistic and reciprocity minded. And Cohen, I think, very rightly points out that there's something that's dissatisfying about this, because it's not, as he put it, true reciprocity, right? In a market social society, yes, you are producing with your comrades at a workplace. You're doing so in a less alienated way. And there's a kind of communal sensitivity that's involved in workplace democracy that you couldn't find in the wage labor system as it exists right now. But you still have competitive firms, right? Yes, the consequences of that competition might be ameliorated by the implementation of something like the difference principle through redistributive mechanisms like you find in social democracy. But we aren't at, the level where we can fully achieve, from each according to their ability to each according to their needs, the kind of ideal articulated in the campy trip example, right? But I'm just not so committed to the idea that we need to reach that. Even if I do think we lose something by not at least keeping it in mind, right? From my practical material standpoint right now, transitioning to a market socialist Rawlsian system where we achieve a high degree of reciprocity, much more than we have right now, should be our immediate short-term goal. And I'd like to point out that I think that there's evidence in Marx's own texts that suggests that he might agree with this position. I'll just go back to the critique of the Gotha program, right? One of the criticisms that he makes of socialism as it existed at this time was this idea that we'd just be able to get rid of the state and all coercive mechanisms and move immediately towards communism, right? He says, no, right? Any transition to a no mode of production invariably needs to be understood historically. The new society is going to be stamped by many features of the old, which means that you're going to have to accept many facts about human nature, human psychology, and social structures as they existed before in the new society, because you're not just going to get a clean break, right? And I think that that's probably true, right? We should be thinking about 5 minutes after capitalism rather than 1,000 years after it, if we want to be practical in our intellectual activities. Although, like I said, it's a beautiful dream to imagine a world of true or full reciprocity.
I mean, look, man, I'm an American. I would be happy if we just gave everybody health care and stopped sending 2,000-pound bombs to the IDF. I think that marketless long-term full communism, is, I'm not going to be that upset if it's not achieved anytime soon. But in any case, this is really good. This is very helpful. I hope everybody else found it such. I should also say, by the way, that while I'm thinking about it, that I also write about some of these subjects in the essay that I wrote for a collection that you and Conrad Hamilton co-edited that's finally coming out, called Flowers for Marx. So I don't know. I don't actually remember the release date of that off the top of my head.
I looked at Punctum the other day. It said summer 2024. So I'm presuming any day now, since it is summer 2024. So just keep an eye out for it.
Okay, fair enough. I think we're probably going to do like a book event in London in November. Details to be determined if that happens. But anyway, yeah, look out for that. That book is coming out at some point. It includes essays about some of these topics that we've been talking about. But in any case, we are going to bring on Jake and Andy. I don't know if you want to join us for that toast or not, Matt. But
I have to go and spend some time with my wife because we're watching a documentary about Nazism.
Okay,
those are fun.
Yeah, just tell her that that you're getting important historical materialist insights about the fights that you've had, so you can't leave just yet. But all right, fair enough. Talk soon, Matt.
Take care. Peace, guys.
Peace. All right, you guys talk amongst yourselves for a minute. I'm gonna go grab a bottle.
Oh, he literally meant it.
You know, we're on a play date right now. You know, you kids play, and you know, we're gonna go grab a drink.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm trying to put a sentence together after that very long, in-depth conversation on
yeah, it's still absorbing some of that.
yeah.
It's like, oh my god, I got to read Rawls too.
Fair enough. Well, yeah. So Jake pointed this out to me a few days ago. That somewhere recently we are up to 30,000 subscribers on YouTube. So yeah, there we go.
Proof.
Proof.
Analytical.
Yeah. We're not just dialectically intuiting it. We have a screenshot showing that there are 30,000 subscribers.
Dialectically, we're at 1 million.
and zero.
Yeah, it's confusing. 1 million and zero at the same time. So yeah, I don't know. It's obviously a small channel, but makes me really proud that we got up there. So yeah, I don't know.
To 60,000.
To 60,000.
Yeah, 60,000.
Left is best.
Sorry, I was digesting that. But anyway, left is best.